Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Oh dear. It's going well, guys. Better, excellent. Welcome to City Hall and welcome to those of you who've made it in person to our spring conference for Centre for London, as well as all of those of you who are joining us online today. I'm Claire Harding, I'm the Research Director at Centre for London. Lovely to see so many familiar faces in the audience, as well as so many new faces, and I'll be your MC for today. For those of you who don't know Centre for London, we're the capital's dedicated think tank. We undertake research into London's critical challenges, inform policy making, and hold events like this one to build networks and strengthen partnerships. As many of you will know, we're a charity and we couldn't put on events like this without the support of our sponsors, so thank you very much to all of you. Be First, Lend-Lease, Peabody, the Port of London Authority, the London Legacy Development Corporation, the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, and the University of East London. And also to our research partners, the London Borough of Newham and Queen Mary University of London. It says a lot about how much wonderful support we've had for this event, but I found it quite hard to memorise that list. Without all of your support, this event just wouldn't have been possible. We also have the very great pleasure of hosting the first event here at the new City Hall in the Royal Docks. And thank you so much to Alex, Steve, and the rest of the GLA team for working so hard with us to make this happen today. It's been absolutely wonderful. You would not have known this was the first event. In case you're wondering about these big round containers, they are going to be full of plants, but you have actually got here even before the plants. Our theme for today is focused on the fastest growing sub-region, East London and the wider South East. We're a decade on for the Olympics now, which seems absolutely unbelievable to me. I met my partner just before the 2012 Olympics, and we're now married and have a child, and I can't quite believe it's 10 years, but there you are. And a decade on from that, East London and South East London are really continuing to evolve and develop. And today is an opportunity to talk about that, to review the lessons of the past, to take stock and develop a vision of London's eastward growth and connections with the wider South East. From the relocation of City Hall, where we are today, to the Thames Freeport and revitalised plans for new neighbourhoods at Thamesmead and at Barking, the future of the region really does seem to be coming into sharper focus at the moment. So today is a really good time to talk about it. And to celebrate that decade since the Olympics, we brought together some really brilliant speakers to help us review the lessons of the past, take stock and develop a vision of London's eastwards growth and its connections to the wider South East. And throughout our programme today, and it's such a packed programme, we really hope to highlight the scale of opportunity and need in East London and work towards a vision and an agenda for action to be shared across boroughs, private sector partners, as well as London and national government. We want to work out what we've learned from previous initiatives in East London, including, of course, London 2012 and the development of the Docklands, which Patrick and I will be talking about shortly. And finally, strengthening the links between investment and lasting benefit for East London's communities. That link between investment and lasting benefit, I think, is a challenge everywhere, but it's a particular challenge here in East and South East London. So whether you're watching, oh dear, I'm just going to keep going. Whether you're watching with us live or in person today, there's loads of ways to get involved in the event. We're obviously really looking forward to chatting with you, those of you who've joined us for live. But we're also using Slido to send questions throughout the event, and that's whether you're here with us in person or watching us online. If you've got a printed programme, you can scan the QR code on the back of that to access Slido, and otherwise you can type into your browser app.sly.do, and the code is 796780. Don't worry if you missed that, I will be boring you to tears by repeating it endlessly throughout the day. And please do use that in particular during the audience Q&A in our panel sessions. The chairs will be able to see it and they'll be taking your questions. You can also take part in discussions on social media throughout the day, particularly on Twitter. We are at Centre for London, and the hashtag is EastX, East by Southeast in your posts. And if you're watching us on Zoom, there's a live chat area which also has Centre for London people in it, where you can discuss ideas and chat with fellow attendees. For those of you who are watching online, you can now let your attention drift for a few seconds while I talk about housekeeping here for those of you who are at the venue with us. In the event of the fire, there are no planned drills for today, so if the alarm sounds, it is real. The fire doors are behind me at the front of the building, which is the nearest exit. This is a nice, easy one. And if an alarm is announced, the assembly point is behind me in front of the cable cars. I'm sure you're already thinking about breaks and when you get to explore this lovely space. We'll have a networking break at 10:55 for 35 minutes or so, and then lunch for those of us who'd like to stay and join us. I hope you all will be at 1 o'clock. Toilets are located in the back corner of the room, just over there next to the cloakrooms. And there is a quiet or prayer room, a multi-faith room to my right. There's a washing area, religious text, prayer mats, and beanbags. And there are also curtains there to segregate areas if needed, and the room is laid out to face east. And finally, on the housekeeping, Wi-Fi. If you want to connect to the public Wi-Fi, search for City Hall Public Wi-Fi, and all you need to do is accept the terms and conditions and get online. And for those of you who are watching online, audience in the room, you get to tune out for a second or so now. If you experience any technical issues, please send us a direct message through Twitter and we will be there to assist you. I say we, I don't mean me. I mean our wonderful communications and events team will be there to assist you. I now have the slightly peculiar task of introducing myself. For this first session, I'm delighted to be co-chairing with Patrick Diamond, Professor of Public Policy at Queen Mary University of London and the Director of the Mile End Institute, who are our research partners for this event. So Patrick, if you'd like to come up and join me, we're going to be talking about 3 areas in East and South East London and how those have been changing over the last few years. Patrick, thank you.
Well, morning, everybody. It's great to be with you. This is the first face-to-face event that I've even been present at, let alone spoken at, for 2 years, apart from lecturing to my students. So it's really good to be here. Really nice to have the opportunity to interact with some real human beings rather than just looking at people over a Zoom call. So I hope today will be a really productive and interesting day. I'm just going to talk about the research that Claire's already mentioned. We are embarking on producing a research report with the Centre of London, which really looks at the experience of change and regeneration in East London over the last 20 years. And we're just going to show you a few slides and really just try to introduce some of the key themes and topics that we hope this report is going to raise as a way of focusing debate about the future of East London as it evolves and develops in the future. So our research focuses on the experience of social change and regeneration in 3 distinctive parts of East London. So one is Poplar, the second is Stratford, and the third is Thamesmead. And an obvious question you can ask right at the beginning is, why did we choose those 3 particular places? Well, of course, they're all, for different reasons, interesting and important in their own right. But we also came to the view that they have each experienced quite distinctive waves of change. Poplar, we know, not least because of the Docklands development, really began to witness accelerated change more than 20 years ago. Whereas in Stratford, we've seen a real acceleration of change over the last 20 years, and indeed more in the last decade, as Claire was saying. And then, of course, in Thamesmead, we really expect in the next 20 years for that to see very significant further regeneration and change. So the aim of our research is really to analyse the impact of regeneration on these communities with 3 key particular questions in mind. First, how do we really get a better understanding of the challenge of how best to level up London? Self-evidently, we know that London is not a homogeneous city. It consists of many different places. They have different characteristics, and they face very particular social and economic challenges. East London, of course, has one of the largest financial districts in the world, but it also has 2 of the largest council estates in the world with significant social housing and other social challenges, a long tail of deprivation and poverty. So there's enormous variation even within a relatively small geographical area of London. How does that relate then to the challenge of levelling up? Second question, what is the role of physical infrastructure, especially transport infrastructure, in the regeneration process? The Docklands Light Railway came first to Poplar, then to Stratford, and of course is expected to link up with Thamesmead, providing vital connectivity into central London. But transport, of course, is only part of the story. The quality of local public services, access to amenities, the sense of community are critical in establishing thriving, livable places. And the third question our report addresses is, what's the most effective way of involving communities in the process of regeneration, particularly where projects such as new housing are being delivered at pace? So if we move on to the next slide, this just shows population change in the 3 areas that our report is covering. And what we can see from the slide is that the rate of population change has obviously been very different across those 3 places. Poplar began to change decades ago, as I've said. So in the last 20 years, the population growth which it's witnessed has been relatively modest. Stratford, in contrast, has witnessed the most dramatic change over the last 20 years. Its population has grown rapidly by more than 300% since 2001. London's population overall has increased, but in Stratford, the rate of growth has been extraordinary. The impact of the Olympics was huge, with 30 years of infrastructure development delivered in just 7 years. And there is now less social deprivation in Stratford, but that is as much to do with population transience than the lives of local residents necessarily being improved. Meanwhile, in Thamesmead, these areas have witnessed modest population growth, and there has been new housing, but the big wave of change there is yet to come. The next slide shows the proportion of the population in these areas aged between 15 and 34. We can see that Stratford has got progressively younger over time, although that trend has begun to tail off. This is an area where people at the beginning of their working lives are able to access a relatively affordable supply of housing. The proportion of young people in Poplar has, in contrast, declined. Housing has become less affordable due to constrained supply. There's less social housing, there's a greater reliance on private rented accommodation, and those who cannot afford to live at home are invariably priced out, particularly families in need of more space. The age profile of Thamesmead has changed relatively little over the last 20 years, but may well change more rapidly in the next 20 as additional affordable housing becomes available. I'm going to now pass back to Claire, who's going to offer us a more forensic analysis of what is going on in these 3 places, the dynamics of social change, and how that impacts on regeneration and housing. So, Claire.
Thank you very much. And before I launch into this part of my discussion, I want to very much thank Farah Hussain of Queen Mary University, Patrick's colleague, for her work on the interviews that underpinned this section, and indeed for her work throughout this project. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join us today, but I think hopefully we'll do her work justice. I think she would have done it better justice. I also want to say that we're talking about 3 really complex places here, really interesting places, places where literally thousands of people live and have lived over many, many years. And of course, that means we're going to oversimplify complex topics and do all the things that as a research director, I absolutely hate doing. We are going to put out a report in a few weeks, which will talk about all of this stuff in much more detail and enable us to go much more in depth into these really complex topics. The other caveat and challenge we have, as I'm sure many of you in the room who are also involved in working with data will have, is that the census is now 11 years out of date. The most recent census data we have access to. These areas have changed quite a lot in the last 11 years. So we're probably talking a little bit less about statistics than we otherwise might have done, although again, there will be quite a lot of that in the report. So with all of those caveats done, I'd like to talk about those 3 places in the order that Patrick's been talking about them. So Poplar, then Stratford, then Thamesmead. And as we've said, not coincidentally, this is also the order in which they've been getting either their first, or in Stratford's case, their second DLR stations. I imagine lots of you will have gone through Poplar on your way here this morning if you came on the DLR, and I imagine quite a lot of you will have come on the DLR because various other sorts of public transport seem to have been a little bit shaky this morning. The DLR has been running beautifully south of Tower Hamlets, north of Canary Wharf, and close to the Queen Mary patch, of course. This picture was taken from one of the tower blocks near Poplar, and I think it sums it up quite nicely with Canary Wharf on the left, the low-rise housing at the core of the area in front of us, and the City of London in front at the west. And people who we've spoken to in this research talk about it as a sort of an island amid the glass and the skyscrapers, very much a place that's cut off and separate from the financial districts around it, but also a cultural island in a way. A working class enclave is the word that's been used, surrounded by this absolutely extraordinary wealth. I think it's important to acknowledge that there are good things that have come from this wealth. Developer contributions to the local area have meant the council has had an awful lot more money to spend on community infrastructure than some of its peer councils. But of course, as I'm sure will be familiar to many of you in this room, that's also brought really big difficulties. And the one that was talked about the most, indeed the one that Patrick's already touched on, is housing. Housing is a massive problem everywhere, and I'm sure we will keep on coming back to it today. But Poplar kind of feels like the ultimate expression of that problem. There's not a lot of supply. It's awarded about 8,000 people, and market prices are just extraordinary for the market housing that's available there. And of course, that means that as children grow up, it's really, really hard for them to afford a home in the area, as we've seen in Patrick's slides already. Quite a lot of people end up staying in really overcrowded homes. We know that's a massive problem in Poplar. Or they move out, and if they move out quite a long way. We were pleased to see in the government's recent Levelling Up white paper, all 350, whatever it was, pages of it, but that issue does get some acknowledgement, but it's definitely an issue that we need to be talking about more when we talk about the specific levelling up needs of London. The next place, of course, is Stratford, with that absolutely astronomical population increase in recent years. Stratford and Newtown Ward has nearly 40,000 residents. It is indeed so big that it's being split at the next election. It's about 6 times the average size of a ward here in England. And a lot of that growth has come from the building on the old Olympic Park site, which we'll be hearing much more about today. And as Patrick said, a lot of that growth has come from young people at the start of their working lives. And what that's made for is a relatively transient community with lots of people kind of moving in and moving out quite quickly. I don't think we should talk about transience as always being a bad thing. I think sometimes in kind of urban fabric discussions, we can talk as if we want everybody to kind of sit down and stay where they are forever and ever. And of course, people moving around is good for economies, it's good for society, it's good for social life, it helps people meet new people and fall in love and do all the things that people do. But when you get too much of it, it really does cause a problem. It makes it harder to create that sense of community. We're going to talk so much more about that today. We've got an absolutely brilliant panel on the Olympic legacy coming up. But for now, I'd like to reflect briefly on the experience that people told Farah and Patrick about being in Stratford. And again, it's one that's so much shaped by the built environment, with newer housing separated from the older housing by bridges and roads. Stratford is very much a place of bridges, roads, and railway connections, I think, to a degree that's absolutely unique anywhere else in the UK, and really compared to any other city I can think of. And the space that was previously the Olympics, of course, was previously industrial land, and industrial land is a great interest to us here at Centre for London. We are fascinated by it, so fascinated that we set up a commission on industrial land a few years ago, and its report came out earlier this year. So if you wanted to learn more about industrial land, please do have a look at that. But I think in this context, what's really important to acknowledge is that just because industrial land doesn't have people living in it, that's its nature, it does still have a community of people working there, and that community has been changed and displaced by the change that's been happening in Stratford. And finally, I'd like to take us across the river to Thamesmead. Doesn't feel so far away today. It's kind of behind us. This might be the one that some of you perhaps haven't been to. It's the furthest out of all of our sites that we looked at. It's in southeast London on the Greenwich-Bexley border, and largely consists of 1970s social housing, which you can see here. It's very striking. Unusually for a large social housing estate, it's split between 2 local authorities, which is why it's got 2 wards, Thamesmead Moorings and Thamesmead East in Greenwich and Bexley. And perhaps more commonly for large areas of social housing, it was built with these extraordinary utopian intentions. And again, quite commonly, those utopian intentions didn't quite work out perhaps the way that they were expected to. Really fascinating thing to read about, by the way. I got deep into rabbit holes about the planned history of Thamesmead, and there was like, you cannot spend the whole day talking about that. Not everybody will be interested. But if, like me, you share a geeky interest in the intentions of social housing development, there's a lot of good stuff out there to read. And like many of those older social housing estates in London and indeed beyond, it's now set for regeneration. And the regeneration project here is massive, about £1 billion, repairs to existing homes, which are of course now about 50 years old, most of them, new homes being built, and the promise of better leisure and culture activities, which is something that was slightly lacking in the original Thamesmead. It was basically just created to be homes. And it's getting new transport too. Abbey Wood Station is on the Elizabeth line, or it will be on the Elizabeth line, or it is on the Elizabeth line and it hasn't quite opened, one of those things. So that will provide connectivity into the southeast of that area. And we're also going to talk about the DLR again, because there is a DLR extension planned for Thamesmead, although in view of Transport for London's financial struggles, it's not quite clear what's going to happen to that. Some people who live in Thamesmead told us that it's really been constantly changing throughout its now 50-odd year existence, but that change is just about to ramp up a notch. And they worry, perhaps understandably, indeed very understandably, that that change won't work for them. And given some of the experience we've had in London, I think that's a very reasonable and legitimate concern. There have been places it's worked well for communities who are already there, and it's been places it's worked considerably less well. Thamesmead is so unique. It's an extraordinary place, I think, because of its geography, because of its scale, because of how it fits into the older areas around it. But it is in some ways facing a similar level of change to Stratford and Poplar, and indeed some other areas here in East and South East London. And I think perhaps there are things we can learn for Thamesmead from what has worked well and less well in those areas. So I'm going to hand back to Patrick at this point to talk about what all of that means for levelling up and indeed for London.
Okay, well, just to share with you, this is the final slide, some of the thinking we've been doing about the policy implications of what we found. Obviously, the purpose of this report principally is to try to discover better what's going on by talking to local stakeholders and residents, and also by analysing data, as Claire was saying. But it would be remiss of us not to discuss what the implications of our research are for public policy. And I want to here just cover three issues briefly. One is about infrastructure. The second is about how we do community engagement. And the third is about levelling up. So in respect of transport, this is a point I think that will be very familiar to many people in this room. But of course, investment in transport infrastructure is a necessary but not sufficient condition for successful regeneration. Areas need investment in social as well as physical infrastructure in order to thrive. That means, of course, access to good public services. It also means access to services like childcare, which was a theme that came up a lot in the interviews that we did. Access to childcare is a major issue in many of these communities, and it's particularly important. Another related issue in terms of public services is, of course, access to good education and the importance of skills. If areas such as these are going to benefit from inward investment, they need human capital and a skilled workforce locally. In particular, and I say this as somebody who is part of Queen Mary University of London, we need to focus on how we can develop more high quality post-16 provision. This is a real priority across East London. My second point is really just about the importance of community engagement in regeneration, a point that came across consistently from our interviews. And again, this will not be a surprise to anybody in this room, is that there is still a lot of cynicism about community involvement in the regeneration process, particularly where we see projects being delivered at pace very quickly. How do we take communities with us? So we need to better understand how engagement can be done well. And of course, this is one of the key questions that we'll be addressing in our final report. Okay, I'm running out of time, so let me just finish on levelling up. We know that London faces significant levelling up challenges in the aftermath of COVID, which hit East London communities particularly hard. There are big differences between East and West London, but there are also very significant differences between inner and outer London. Londoners' life chances vary enormously according to where they live and the housing that they can access. And again, we've really tried to show in our report how outer London in particular, and this includes the communities we're talking about in this report, particularly in Thamesmead, is perceived to be less well served by politicians and government than inner London. And the risk, unless this is addressed, is that it will sow the seeds of disillusionment with local democracy and local politics. So there's a real job of work to do to try to break down this perceived division between how well inner London is served in comparison to communities in outer London. I will just finish with this thought, which is that Claire has already mentioned the government's very substantial levelling up white paper. I think it's 351 pages.
Thank you.
At the last time of reading. But there is obviously an ever-present danger that the government will level down London by cutting funding and investment. And we could see how that would affect the communities we're discussing in this report, particularly Thamesmead. And yet we know that less money for transport and infrastructure will mean lower productivity and employment in London. And the overall consequence of that will be less tax for the Treasury and therefore less funding for public services across the UK. So there's an ongoing job of work to do to convince this government that there is a levelling up priority within London as well as in the the rest of the UK. Those are just a few of our preliminary findings. I hope that's given you some indication of the kinds of issues that the report is going to be touching on, and I'll hand back to Claire just to conclude the session.
Thank you very much, Patrick. It's been such a pleasure working with Queen Mary University of London on this report, and I think it provides us with a really nice and easy segue into our next panel, which of course I have managed to get onto the wrong page of my notes, this always happens, about the Olympic legacy here in London. And in this panel, we're going to be assessing whether that Olympic legacy delivered on jobs, housing and opportunity for Londoners, what the city can learn from large-scale placemaking and developments, and what the successes, failures, and what more indeed needs to be done. Just a reminder, I told you I was going to keep doing this, to log on to Slido and submit any questions for the panel Q&A at the end. The code is 796780. So it's an absolute pleasure to introduce Professor Amanda Broderick, Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of East London. Amanda, please do come and take your seat, and I will leave you to introduce your panel. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. First of all, can you hear me okay? I'm very conscious of the acoustics in this fantastic building, but you can hear me. Great, lovely. Thank you for that thumbs up at the back there. I'm delighted to welcome you here today for our first question and answer panel, reflecting on the fact that we're here in the 10th anniversary of Olympics 2012, and for us to have a critical view of the legacy that the Olympics have left East London. I am particularly pleased to be able to welcome our esteemed panel, who will be sharing their thoughts on whether the Olympics has delivered on jobs, on housing and opportunity for East Londoners, what the city can learn from these large-scale placemaking events, and what have been the successes and indeed the lessons learned, and what more still needs to be done for us all. So please welcome Lynn Garner, Chief Executive of the London Legacy Development Corporation, the body responsible for the development of Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park and its surrounding areas. Dr. Penny Bernstock, co-chair of Telco's Olympic Strategy Group, which campaigns to ensure that key legacy commitments around jobs and housing are met. Roxana Fies, Mayor of the London Borough of Newham and lead member for Inclusive Economy and Housing Delivery. And Neil Coleman, partner at Blackstock Partnership and former board member of the Olympic Delivery Authority. And I'd like to pick up first the impact of sport on our East London community. I lead the University of East London, and as the former home of both Team USA and Team GB medical team in 2012, the University of East London now works with over 2,000 primary school children weekly in the borough to raise aspirations as part of our Sport in the Futures programme. It's supported by Sport England to run the East London Talent Pathway for athletes from economically disadvantaged circumstances, is London's talent hub for Basketball England, and sponsors East London Phoenix, the founding member of the professional British Wheelchair Basketball Women's Premier League. So Lynn, how has the legacy of the Olympic Games increased the diversity of the sporting talent pipeline and wider opportunities more generally?
Okay, assuming everyone can hear me. There are 8 permanent structures or Olympic venues that have been maintained on the park. Some of those are structures, others are iconic venues like the Aquatic Centre, the Copper Box Arena, the Tennis and Hockey Centre, and indeed the Velodrome. All of those facilities are still used for international events. They're all locally accessible to people at affordable prices. And it's true to say that there are 2 really good examples there, I would quote, 3 actually. So the Copper Box Arena and the community track, which is just behind the stadium, are available for a huge number of community sports groups to use at affordable prices. So they're all diverse local people using those facilities. And then 1 million people access the swimming pool at the Aquatic Centre to swim every year at the same price as their local pool. And 60,000 school children from local schools learn to swim at the Aquatic Centre, so they're world-class facilities. And the reason I mentioned the iconic nature of the venues is that those kids are learning to swim alongside Tom Daley, training in his diving school there, and Ellie Simmons. And so we're hopeful that some of that inspiration rubs off through the sporting organisations like UKA, that also come to the park on an annual basis to run their Diamond League events, so that we can see new talent coming through to the more elite levels. Probably still to be measured, I would say, given the 10 years since the Games.
Would anyone like to pick up any points on that one?
I do think the venues have been managed generally well, and I absolutely endorse what Lynn says. It is amazing to go into the Aquatic Centre and see the swimming lessons going on there, and the number of kids from Newham who have been who have learnt to swim there. I can remember actually talking with Roxana's predecessor about the Aquatic Centre, who was adamant that people would never use it, that local people in Newham wouldn't use the facility, and wanted, you know, tubes and slides. And I think that would have been a bad mistake. And I think actually what we have there is fantastic. I do think that sort of generally there was this overall aspiration for the Olympics that it would promote massive increases in sport participation across the country. And I don't think that has been successfully achieved. I think people were not willing to invest the sums of money in coaching and training and so on that were needed, and that probably are done in some countries. I think Finland is a fantastic example of where that works. But I do think on the park, we did see not just the venues, but some strongly funded programs by Sport England, both addressing athletes and mass participation, and also Paralympic and disabled athletes. And I think those were very, very successful programs, and, you know, reached hundreds of thousands of people. So I think that's something which is actually a broader lesson, but it does need the public investment.
If I may just add, notwithstanding what Lynn has said, just in terms of what has been achieved in the 10-year period since Olympics came to London, we've got to understand where we need to go next over the coming 10 years. If we understand sporting legacy in the context of the health, well-being needs and impact of resident communities in the localities of Tower Hamlets, Newham, Waltham Forest, and also Hackney, because we still have quite high rates of health inequality, which very much made our resident communities exposed during the last 2 years as a consequence of COVID-19. And if you begin to align the health inequality metrics, be that in the context of childhood obesity and other diseases, we need to understand where next for the sporting legacy and how that needs to be repurposed to achieve better outcomes as a lasting legacy for local people.
Well, perhaps we can pick that up in further detail a little bit later. But Roxana, what for you have the local residents in the Olympic boroughs gained in terms of social and economic impact more generally? And if we could start from the beginning, knowing everything that we do now, what would you do differently to optimise the legacy further? And as you've already said, perhaps take it into the future.
So speaking specifically from the Newham context, and there have been quite exacting discussion amongst leaders of the 4 growth boroughs that make up the partnership with the LLDC. The socio-economic impact of the Olympics and its legacy needs to be more effectively optimised and realised in terms of more sustainable jobs as we advance towards a fairer set of outcomes economically for our people. We have a situation where mean incomes for households in Newham are still way below the London average. And similarly, security of jobs is something that needs to be powered further over the next 10 years, but it's not the job and the task of the LLDC and its successor body alone. There's a requirement clearly for all the partners to be arriving at a clarity of purpose around the specific socioeconomic outcomes that we want to see for our young people. There was Patrick during his presentation talking about the need for high-skilled jobs, jobs of the future that command those high incomes, and how we enable that through our work as a partnership in the LLDC. I'm particularly excited about the potential of the Innovation District in the LLDC with regards to that. So I think there's been some great things that have happened over the last 10 years in terms of access to jobs, skills acquisition, but much more to be done.
Penny, did you want to pick up further any points there?
I think there's much more to be done around housing. Newham has, and the East London boroughs generally have the greatest level of housing need in England, Newham in particular. And we are, I think the real risk is that we have regenerated an area, but it's for a different group of people. So the main beneficiaries currently on the park living there will be professional groups. And I can't see those routes in without a fundamental shift in policy around housing that's going to address that. So I think that's really central, to address housing, and much more affordable housing, and a much more imaginative approach. I think building on the fantastic work being done in Newham around community wealth building, we need to think, how can we really make sure that this legacy that was promised, which was, just to remind you, it will become a model of social inclusion, where it'll be for the direct benefit of everyone who lives there, and that has not happened. I've done lots of research, and we need to be doing much more around giving people access to that space. So we've created a really great space, but the problem is it's really not speaking to the needs of the communities. And you've got people in Newham bidding for 10 years, living in really, really terrible housing, and they're living next to this. And so lots of the affordable housing on the park is shared ownership. You need a £45,000 deposit. You need an income of about 60,000. So it becomes meaningless. So, I think there's a lot more that needs to be done.
So, Lynn, picking up on Penny's point and also some of Roxana's comments, how does the LLDC work with other levers to unlock the potential of the legacy, whether that's the enterprise zone here at Docklands, or the innovation hub that Roxana talked about, or other entities to be able to increase the impact?
Yeah. Well, if we start with jobs, a considerable number of jobs have come to the park. Some of those have relocated from other areas. We have 2 new business districts. One is a corporate office district at International Quarter London. We have the digital technical hub at Here East, which is fantastic, employs around 5,000 people. And we have a creative enterprise zone at Hacknewick and Fish Island. So different kinds of things going on. The vast majority of the jobs in those areas are high-skilled jobs. What we need to be doing is making sure that we get the turnover in those jobs for local, diverse talent, and there are a number of routes through that. Last year, LLDC invested in something called the Good Growth Hub, where all the employers on the park are encouraged to come through the Good Growth Hub for skills matching, jobs and skills opportunities focus there, working with local talent. We look in some ways across London, but we do focus on the 4 growth boroughs in our immediate neighbourhood for those opportunities. And I think they will be huge over time. And we've also got East Bank coming, the Arts, Culture and Education District, which will bring a number of new opportunities. But I think the turnover as we go forward is where we need to focus. Obviously, these institutions will come with existing staff to kickstart their operation. But when those jobs turn over, there's a real opportunity there to be able to grasp that over the next 5 to 10 years. We've done a number of things. So we have a whole construction school going on as well. Construction's not just about bricklaying and plastering, which is the way that I think about it. It's now about digital skills and so on. So there's a huge piece of work there. That's a partnership with Transport for London. So it's looking at other construction opportunities around East London so that people can get an apprenticeship and then properly go through a career in construction. And I went to meet the apprentices there quite recently. That can cope with 500 people a year. So it's quite a big facility there on the park. And eventually it will relocate, we hope, into the Royal Docks once we've built on that land where it's currently based. We So look, the thing about housing is LLDC is a development corporation wholly owned by the Mayor of London. It's had different kinds of housing, affordable housing policies to run with since the days of Ken Livingstone and now the days of Sadiq Khan. And those housing policies have changed. And affordable housing, Penny's right. Personally, I think there does need to be a sea change in funding of affordable housing, but that funding comes from central government ultimately. And the LLDC operates within its policy frameworks, and they've changed, as I say, as the mayors have changed. We've always delivered in accordance with policy. Some of the good stuff that we've done, including affordable housing, which I'll come back to in terms of numbers, we have built very high quality sustainable homes on the park. They are exemplar homes. And at the end of the project, 64% will be 2-bed plus. Now, there are members of the development community in this room, and that's pretty unheard of, actually, for 64% of those homes to be 2-bed plus. So we are focused on family homes. Over the whole project, there will be 40% affordable. That's of the homes within the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, within the control of LLDC in the terms that lever of our land ownership, where we're able to do a bit more than policy. A good number of those are shared ownership. And of that 40% affordable, around a third of those will be pure social rent. So recently, we were asked by the Mayor of London to bring forward 50% affordable on public land. That's being done. Within that 50% affordable, 30% will be socially rented. When we look at the whole, that's quite a small proportion given the policy changes we've seen across the piece and over the years since we started building in 2012, those new neighbourhoods. Hope that sort of gives a sense of it.
Thank you. Ian.
Yeah, I mean, I think what both Penny and Lynn have said in slightly different ways is that this is really an issue about overall housing policy at government level and at London level. It's not an issue that is anything, it's no different, it's not a specific issue to the Olympic legacy. Right across London, the same problems arise in big and small schemes around the cost of shared ownership housing and how affordable that is, around how much social housing, and it is politically driven. I mean, let's be clear, when I was at the GLA, Ken Livingstone did sign up to an agreement with Telco to do 50% affordable housing. That was a clear agreement which he and others signed up to. He happened to lose an election, and the person who came in after didn't have that policy. And that's why it changed. And it's changed since, I think, for the better under the current mayor. But these are national policy and London policy decisions that are not specific to the Olympic legacy. I think the LLDC has, within that framework, not done a bad job in the way it's particularly delivered brilliant quality housing, a lot of which has been social housing. The fact that the Olympic Village itself, the original construction, was 50% affordable, was a significant achievement, particularly as it was built in the immediate aftermath of the crash in property and capital markets worldwide. Yes, there was quite a chunk of shared ownership in there. Shared ownership is not that affordable for people on the lowest incomes. That's, again, an issue of national policy. I mean, you know, one thing I would say to Penny here, perhaps, is I've been a strong supporter of the campaigns that Telco and London citizens have put forward over affordable housing. I do think, though, that the focus around the Olympic demands that they put forward on community land trust housing was a mistake. I'm not saying community land trust housing isn't important, but it has issues around affordability itself, and it has issues around equity and allocation and so on. And I think the stuff that Penny has written about is really the key issues, the issues about what are the costs, how people can afford it on the lowest incomes, what do we do about very high-priced shared ownership. But those, I think, are issues that need to be tackled for the whole of London, for this part of London as well, but not just for this part of London.
I would add, just building on what Lynn said, there's been an absolute evolution of the LLDC's sort of position around issues of affordability, and the work that they've done with the growth boroughs has been significant on that front, as there's a consensus and an absolute ambition clearly stated that we've got to make the legacy work, both in the context of housing and social and economic outcomes. And one of the things that Lynn said as part of her response to the question was in relation to, you know, the high skill jobs that are coming through, the talent pipeline, avenues or pathways that are being developed. There's a consensus and a commitment across the 4 borough partners to make this work effectively for our people, and we're seeing the fruits of that. You know, over the last 4 years, you know, being on the, you know, at the table in terms of seeing the last 4-year journey, there's been a demonstrable material shift, you know, the commitment to inclusive growth and a deeper understanding of what that has to mean for local people, a recognition and acknowledgement that we need to also address issues of disproportionality as it pertains to Black, minority, ethnic communities in our localities, because that's also an area that we need to advance further and accelerate our focus around, and the connectivity between what's emerging in the LLDC and the amazing stuff that's emerging in the Royal Docks as part of the wider Royal Docks Enterprise Zone, and making sure that those 2 big pieces, major significant pieces, not just for East London, but for the wider London economy, are going to be so fundamental for the future sustainability of London as a fair global city. And it's really, really exciting.
Absolutely. And picking up on a comment, a challenge that Roxana had already highlighted around East London health and wellbeing, and Penny, if I can go to you first. Men and women living in East London have some of the lowest life expectancies in the capital. Newham has some of the highest rates of childhood obesity in England and experience some of the greatest health inequalities in Europe. Why is this the case? And did the Olympics do anything to shift the dial on people's health and well-being in this sub-region?
Well, I think to shift the dial on health and well-being, we need to return to the kind of policies that Roxana's talking about and some of the work around the good growth and connecting up, because housing is a key kind of dimension, social determinant of health, and until you address the chronic housing problems in East London, you know, you're going to have trouble, promoting health and well-being in that sense. More equal societies have healthier people, so we need to think about how do we make things more equal. And, you know, and I think I agree with Roxana, there's lots of good stuff happening on the park, but I think it's around pushing it much further, actually, so that the inclusive growth hub needs to think about housing and jobs and well-being. It needs to join policies up. And I think, you know, if we ask a question about health and regeneration, it's about how do we join policies up to think across, you know, in different ways around housing, around food, access to food, and all of those things to promote, you know, better living standards.
I was going to say, absolutely. It's important to make the distinction around the locus of the LLDC as an agency in these areas, and actually the locus lies within the local authorities, and actually how we connect in a collaborative, outcomes-focused way to address all of those issues of inequality and poverty fundamentally, that in part are a manifestation of structural inequality, including racism, and how we engage with the wider health partnership and the NHS to unlock the resources to reverse health inequality issues, which are profound and significant, not just in Newham and the East London growth boroughs, but also the sub-region of East London. So Newham is part of the local London sub-regional partnership comprising of 9 local authorities. And when you look at the health inequality picture, it's really, really stark. So it's about how do we have better, effective, optimizing conversations with the NHS and the integrated care mechanisms that are now going to be going live to unlock what are not insignificant amounts of money in terms of health money and resourcing, and working with our wider health partnerships and holding them to account.
Thank you. Moving on from there, Neil, how did the Olympics affect attitudes towards and in London? Do we have any long-term benefit from this? And how could this be further built upon?
Yeah, well, interesting question. I mean, a lot of this is sort of fairly intangible, isn't it? I mean, I think there was a
Spirit of London.
Spirit of London, and you know, it's a long time ago. We're coming up to the 10th year anniversary, but I think anyone who was in London during the Games and the Paralympics, it was a quite remarkable time. I mean, I probably am not the best person to say that because I was quite close to it. I was actually mainly stuffed in an office during that period. But I just think, you know, the spirit that was represented to an extent by the opening ceremony of the Games, and the messaging there around the NHS, around equality to an extent, and the things that we should be proud of about London, the way in which the transport services functioned, all these things were amazing. I mean, I think we've gone a long way backwards in many ways since then in terms of attitudes nationally. I think we have had an incredibly divisive period, often exploited for political purposes, and unfortunately that still seems to be continuing at the moment. And I don't know, I still think that when you go to East London, when you go to the LLDC, when you look at a lot of the local organisations that are working there, the local cultural groups, you look at what's happening in a lot of the schools, you know, fantastic results in Newham, in the Newham schools. So I think there's still a lot of really positive stuff happening in East London. I mean, one of the choices that got made now in the legacy development of the park was the choice, which actually both the last two mayors have supported, to go for this big culture and education district, to bring University College London into the park. I mean, I can remember when we were sitting around after the Games talking about legacy, we thought, could we get another university in addition to Birkbeck into the park? I think we've now got 4. And those institutions, together with the V&A that's moving, Sadler's Wells, the BBC's music's all going to be there. All those organisations have commitments to work closely with local communities. And it fits with the community wealth building agenda that Roxana's promoted so much. These are new anchor institutions that we look to work really solidly with people in East London, with communities, in the schools, in the colleges. And I think there's a huge amount of hope and optimism there. And I think it was the right choice, because you could say there was a bit of a bargain there, because again, some of the money, some of the land value that's making that possible could have gone into producing more affordable housing. So it's a slightly difficult balance to draw, but I think the potential is there, and I think that can bring back, in fact, it's not bringing back, I think it's maintaining the spirit, the best things about 2012 that, you know, I think really offer exciting new prospects for Newham and for East London.
I have a slightly different perspective, but it's not inconsistent to what Neil has said. The Spirit of London, as evoked in 2012, was right for its time, and then life gets in the way. You know, who could have anticipated the London terrorist attacks? Who could have anticipated Brexit, you know, manifesting in the way that it did, and everything in between, including COVID-19. But Neil's absolutely right. You know, as a global city that is London, it's constantly evolving. It's an amazing place. And I'm really excited about what the East Bank Quarter is going to present London as, in terms of our powerhouse of cultural export. And we need to be thinking more about how do we evolve the sense of the spirit of London that's right and fit for purpose for here and now and 10 years on, as opposed to looking 10 years back. And that's certainly the frame and the lens through which us here in Newham are thinking about legacy. Yes, 10 years on for us means not 10 years, 2012, but 10 years on ahead, given everything that's emerged. And it's just really, really exciting.
Absolutely, and just taking that point a little bit further, the Olympic boroughs are really the gateway to the world, aren't they? Two-way gateway, and thinking about the horrors going on in Ukraine at the moment, and the fact that we are ready to welcome Ukraine refugees. Last year, you welcoming Afghanistani refugees, and indeed our community being a truly global community. What other lessons learned and some of the positives that we've picked up on can we use to welcome and support our flow of people into and indeed out of our Olympic regions?
You're absolutely right. East London is a gateway to the rest of the world, certainly the place that we're all sitting. The Royal Docks, I always liken the Royal Docks as London's gateway to the world. And in Newham, we have some 240 languages and dialects spoken. And as it so happens, yesterday, I was at one of our our first Ukrainian community event, discussing the horrors of what Ukrainians literally coming to Newham 5 days ago had experienced, and their sense of, being in a place where there was an evoking of this is your home and you will be welcomed, and there is this diversity that will embrace you, was really comforting for them. And I think that's something that we've successfully evoked in the ongoing development of the LLDC as part of a really powerful social legacy of the Olympics over the last 4 years. Similarly, I spend a lot of time in the Olympic Park because it's part of Newham, my home, and I've had the pleasure of seeing Tom Daley practicing in the aquatics pool. But one thing that has struck me when I go to the park with my nieces and nephews is just the increasing diversity of local people enjoying the space. And I think that's something that is like magic we need to capture in a bottle and just sustain it. And I'm very confident, given the conversations that we've been having on the LLDC board, where I sit alongside other borough representatives, that's something that will be sustained.
Thank you. Okay, I think it's time now to go to the audience, both physically and virtually, for any questions or indeed comments that the audience has about the legacy of the Olympics. Yes, we have a colleague at the back. And just for the team, I can't get back into the online virtual questions, I'm afraid.
Nick Sharman. I'm the Hackney representative on the LLDC's Planning Decisions Committee, and have had 8 years, if you like, representing the other side of this. And I do think it's important to say there is a serious lack of balance in what the outcome of this development, in particularly around social housing. There are about 20,000 homes which will be built in the Olympic Park over the next over the 20-year period up to 2032. Less than 2,000 of those will be available for people who can actually afford it in the area. Because remember, as Penny said, the affordable housing is fundamentally unaffordable for anyone on average incomes, not people in need, on average incomes. So I think we've got the balance seriously wrong here. And I do agree with Lynn that at a late stage, the authority has, the Development Corporation has addressed this issue about jobs. But the Good Growth Hub is coming on very late. In the last 2 years of the LLDC's life, it has about 30 or 40 people, when we're talking about literally thousands. So I think the £9 billion of public money that went into the Olympics has not done what Ken Livingstone promised in Singapore, that this would be a fundamental rebalancing of East and West London. So I do think there is a very serious lesson. If we have a development corporation driven by money and property, we will get fundamentally divided outcomes. And what we're doing is to build in, over the long term, the fundamental problems of London rather than addressing them.
Okay, thank you. So a real challenge there. Beyond the national housing policy that I think that colleagues have made clear already. Lynn, is there anything that you'd like to pick up there?
Well, just a couple of things. So Nick and I know each other very well. He's been a very valued member of the Planning Decisions Committee for many years. The numbers around the wider Mayoral Development Corporation are 33,000 homes by 2036. That's the target. 11,500 have been delivered. A further 13,000 are in the pipeline, have planning permission, and the rest are still to come. Now, where we have more control is on the land we own in and around the park. The number is just over 5,000 homes, and there will be 40% affordable of different types. Now, as I said earlier, the social rent numbers, if we talk about true affordable rent, are much lower across the piece. They're about 18% of the whole. And in that 50% target where Sadiq Khan has just moved the dial, we will see 30% of the affordable as pure social rent. So we are starting to see those policy changes really hit the ground. I do disagree on the Good Growth Hub. I think that LLDC has worked for some time with the boroughs on bringing jobs to the area. But really speaking, having brought those jobs in, those highly skilled jobs in Here East and in International Quarter London, and indeed in Hackneywick and Fish Island in the Creative Enterprise Zone, and with these two new university campuses and the Innovation District that's coming, it's the turnover of those jobs that are actually important. And the Good Growth Hub, I would argue, has invested just at the right time to capture the turnover from those organisations that have been here a couple of years now. As jobs turn over, that's when we will get the returns for local people, provided we can work in partnership with the boroughs. And that's really going to be important to join that up, I think.
Thank you.
If I may, can I just also add, and similarly, I know Nick, hi, really to reassure you, do not underestimate the amount of heavy lifting that myself, Phil in Hackney, Rachel from Tower Hamlets, and Grace Williams from Waltham Forest undertake in ensuring the inclusive economic piece as it pertains to the LLDC now and in the future, because it will evolve. There will be a point at which the LLDC as we know it doesn't exist, and there will be other arrangements. Planning powers will be coming back to the local authorities by the end of 2024, and there is much more consensus, and we cannot account for a period of time in the lifetime of the LLDC where there was a policy political instruction to do this as opposed to what our people needed, and that has shifted.
I'm going to move us on because we have quite a few questions here. Regeneration, this is from Jennifer Deathong from the London Borough of Lewisham. Regeneration at the Olympic Park was a national investment and arguably a prototype for levelling up. What lessons can other local authorities take from this transformational change so that our future projects build on best practice? Penny, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're on track for levelling up on the park, and I don't think it's a good example of levelling up, although there are some good policies. I think that we need to accept that and have a really honest conversation about what do we learn, because we wouldn't want to reproduce what we've done on the Olympic Park elsewhere. I don't think I want to add any more.
Okay. Neil?
Well, I think one thing you have to recognise about what's happened in Stratford and the Olympic Park is the enormous amount of public investment that took place there. And we can argue about whether it's produced the right outcomes. I don't agree with Penny in what she says that it's not an important exemplar, because I think it's transformed an area that was I mean, look, when we won the Olympics, there were high voltage power lines all over that land, sterilising it. It meant no development was possible. There was no connectivity at all across the land between Tower Hamlets and Newham. There were no utilities there. we had to build 2 power stations. We had to bury those power lines 10 meters below the earth. We had to build, I think, 80 bridges to put connectivity there. You can see the huge land bridges that cross the A12 and now connect the park with Hackney Marshes. It's an unimaginable transformation from what was there before, and you can go and look at the pictures to see that. And I don't see what the point of running that down is, to be honest. Obviously, national housing policies have driven what's happened there. And those housing policies changed when we got a Conservative government and a Conservative mayor. Personally, I regret that, but it's not the fault of the Olympic legacy that those political changes happened. And I'm glad to say, and I agree with Roxana, that changes in politics in London have improved that situation. I think what it does show is that the scale of ambition that you have for big regeneration projects, transformative projects, need vast amounts of public investment in infrastructure. You look at a project like Old Oak Common, which is talked about now. I don't believe we will see the public investment that's necessary to drive change in an area like that. So I just think that, you know, we need to recognize the national political will that needs to be behind delivering changes. In the Levelling Up white paper, there's talk about delivering 20 sort of King's Cross style regeneration projects. We all know that won't happen. There won't be the money for that.
Thank you. We've got the microphone for this gentleman here. Just, oh, could you raise your hand, please, just here? Thank you.
Oh, thanks. My name is Eric Reynolds. I've been in the area for 40 years, so I've seen all sorts of nothing in some places. I think we should be keeping our fingers crossed. The stuff that happened on the Olympic Park is indeed transformational and marvelous. Unfortunately, we don't seem to have space, and this is my question. Can we find space for smaller, more fleet of foot, more locally active activity? Everything we've talked about is very big. This, after all, is a place where master plans used to come to die. The LSE students had a quick look at the number of master plans for exactly where we're sitting now. When they got to 64, they gave up, thinking no one would ever believe that number of fees had been pushed out without a single anything arriving. And this building, of course, the people who built it quietly folded their tents and went away. And just down the river here, if only it was the river, just down the dock here, RIP ABP. No one seems to be talking about that. Yeah. Is that a place for low-cost housing instead of empty offices? Should we be taking land back? This light, easy, quick, cheaper approach just doesn't occur here. But this is a place where it could really work. One of the marvelous things about the East End is it's full of active, intelligent, energetic people. And they're all kept out. And they're kept out by scale. So my question is, please, can we find some space for lighter, quicker, cheaper activity during the lifetime of people, not waiting until they're dead? 40 years on, the space entirely behind you now is empty. It was an absolute powerhouse. Obviously, things changed, the world's changed, but there was enough energy in ships sitting out behind you there to run all the electric lights in Newham. Yeah. And it's all gone. And we haven't speedily moved on. You've mentioned Ken. Wonderful Ken had intentions long ago to put into Millennium Mills there an exciting place. Didn't happen. And it goes on. As long as we continue to talk about value of property rather than value of people, we'll continue to be really slow. The sort of waste that we just allow.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Major point there.
Yeah.
Roxana,
if I may, Eric, with all due respect, because I'm the co-chair of the Royal Docks Enterprise Zone, working with the programme board, and over the past 4 years and the last 3 years specifically, we've addressed the issue of the Royal Docks having some 65, 70 iterations of master plans And actually, we've revived and resolved and renewed its economic purpose. We've hardwired community wealth building in the plans. There's a whole range of strategies that are being delivered by the programme board, and absolutely there is the intention, and it is happening, for workspaces, for local small businesses, entrepreneurs from the locality to benefit from this space. It is increasingly becoming animated, revived, and involving of people. And I'm not entirely sure where you live, but I'm happy to have a chat with you outside of this meeting and take you around the Royal Docks. We've got the Millennium Mill site that's going to be unlocked through the Silver Town development that's being driven forward by Lend-Lease. It's going to be a really amazing scheme. And then just quickly, if I may, picking up on the previous question relating to the Olympic Park and its national significance, let's not underestimate the significance of the Olympic Park as a piece in a wider area called Stratford, which will have ongoing local significance for the local economy and its people, but also significance for London as a whole and internationally.
Thank you, Roxana. We have come to the end of our time today. Just quickly, the poll that colleagues have been asked to complete, which of these do you think has been the biggest lasting legacy of the 2012 London Olympics? 34% said more housing development and 34% said boost in London landmarks and international tourism. And just to finish on a positive note, because we have had a challenging and positive, constructive question and answer, at the University of East London's Archives and Special Collections, we actually house the British Olympic Association's archive collection with documents and memorabilia that goes back from the London Olympics of 1908 through to 2012 and beyond. And these historical treasures are open to the public. And as we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the 2012 Olympics, what better time to come along to the university and to view them? Yeah. So to close, I'd like to thank our panel members, Lynn, Neil, Penny and Roxana, and of course our audience here physically and online. Thank you everyone, and enjoy the rest of your event.
Thank you very much, Amanda and colleagues, for that really interesting panel and lots of opportunities to carry on that discussion in the break. In just a second, I'm going to introduce Jules Pipe for our keynote session, but first, a couple of tedious bits of housekeeping, or possibly not tedious. If you are sitting with a space next to you, we are very lucky today. There are lots of people here. Please shuffle up either now or after the break so that people have an opportunity to sit down, because we've got some people standing. And secondly, my apologies for the confusion mentioning Zoom earlier. The event is on YouTube, and if you are needing to watch it for whatever reason, then you can find the link on our website. And now it's my very great pleasure to introduce the Deputy Mayor of London to share the Greater London Authority's vision for this part of the city and its connectivity with the wider South East. Unfortunately, Jules can't be with us in person today, but he is going to be beamed in on your screens on just a second from now. Jules Pipe, Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you, although only virtually. I'm sorry that COVID is preventing me from being in the room with you today. In the brand new building in the heart of East London. It's so apposite that you're holding this where you are. 10 years on now from the 2012 Olympics. It really is amazing, I think, to reflect on the transformation that's taken place in the area. And the momentum that there is around new development across the whole of East London. I think the scale of opportunity is truly staggering. East London has the largest concentration of what we call at City Hall opportunity areas. It has the capacity for around 250,000 new homes, as well as tens of thousands of new jobs going forward. And together, these opportunity areas represent about half the development capacity of London as a whole. Significant plans for new neighbourhoods coming to fruition in areas like Thamesmead and Barking. A new economic area, new economic opportunities are always opening up from the growing life sciences cluster that we're seeing in Tower Hamlets to the thriving tech hub around the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. There are the new plans for film studios in Dagenham, to the incredible potential of the Thames Estuary Production Corridor, which I know Shona will be saying more about later on. And meanwhile, we have Eastbank establishing new centres for world-renowned cultural and educational institutions in the heart of East London. So I think it's not hyperbole to say that, you know, London's centre of gravity really is moving eastwards with all these developments. But as we all know, there is still huge need across the area, as well as the great potential. Deep-seated inequalities persist. Many of those, if not all of them, have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And that's why the Mayor's so committed to ensuring that in realising the development potential in this great part of the city, we've got to be completely focused on good growth. And that's growth that's socially and economically inclusive and environmentally sustainable. So what does that mean in practice? Well, it's got to be about working directly with communities affected by development and change, to understand and respond to their needs, putting their voice at the centre of development plans. It's got to be about building the quality, affordable homes that everyone needs. It's about taking bold action to tackle the climate crisis and our toxic air through zero carbon development, sustainable travel, urban greening. It's about sensitive conservation of heritage assets and protecting and developing the social and cultural facilities that communities need and value. Good growth's got to be about safe and accessible public realm, healthy streets, curating mixed and vibrant high streets and town centres, and protecting the industrial land that we need to keep the whole city functioning. And good growth means embracing smart city principles with new technologies and world-class digital connectivity, all to help improve the lives of Londoners and enable businesses to really thrive. But ultimately, it means working in partnership to ensure that placemaking really works for residents of all ages, all backgrounds, enabling everyone to be able to reach their potential and really lead healthy and fulfilling lives. So what do we need to be in place to make all of this happen? Well, firstly, we need deep and meaningful collaboration between the public and private sector partners at the local, regional and national levels to all help shape development proposals and coordinate investment in enabling infrastructure. This is the approach that we've been taking to produce the opportunity area planning frameworks across East London, working closely with the boroughs, with TfL, landowners, and of course, crucially, local communities. We only have the capacity to do about one OAPF a year, and I think it speaks volumes that the last two and the one we're currently working on are all in the East. In Tower Hamlets, there's the planning framework for the Isle of Dogs and South Poplar. That was adopted in 2019. In Greenwich and Bexley, there's the Thamesmead and Abbey Wood OPF. That was adopted in 2020. And now there's the Newham and Royal Dock. And in Newham, there's the Royal Docks and Beckton Riverside OAPF. And we've just been consulting on that. And in many ways, the process of understanding and planning for opportunities areas is as important as the production of the planning documents themselves. Relationships and partnerships are built, motivations and concerns are understood, synergies identified, efficiencies promoted, hopefully speeding delivery, but all of that has the intention of ensuring good growth. And in practice, this means establishing the principles of sustainable development together. And that would include the kinds of social infrastructure new and existing communities need, from schools, health centres, cultural and community facilities. It would establish the green infrastructure that needs to be in place for a healthy, livable, net zero city, parks, cycleways, through to sustainable urban drainage systems. And also the transport and energy infrastructure we need to access and service new neighbourhoods. So at the GLA, we've developed an infrastructure coordination service to facilitate the collaboration we need to plan effectively for good growth. And this has been working with Tower Hamlets to deliver a full range of infrastructure strategies for the Isle of Dogs, from an integrated water management strategy to a local area energy plan, waste strategy, digital strategy. So for the first time, we've been working directly with utility companies on these, producing strategies that have buy-in on all sides so that collectively we can enable the good growth that we all want to see. As well as utilities, investment in transport infrastructure is absolutely critical to unlocking sustainable development. And the prospect of the Elizabeth Line has been opening up significant development opportunities in East London, underscoring the importance of continuing to invest in transport to unlock growth. Investment that's needed would include new schemes like the DLR extension from Galleons Reach to Thamesmead via Beckton Riverside. And along with bus transit between Woolwich and Abbey Wood, this could unlock up to 30,000 new homes and support 2 new and regenerated town centres, boost productivity in the Thames estuary along the production corridor and more. But investment's also needed in existing stations such as Stratford that are nearing capacity and have already played a significant role in supporting regeneration. That's why it's so critical to secure a sustainable funding deal for TfL following the devastating impact of the pandemic on its finances. And that's not only to ensure existing services are safeguarded and frequent, but also to deliver schemes which are key to London's future and also key to levelling up the inequalities that exist within our city. I can't speak at the first major conference at the new City Hall without saying a few words about the Royal Docks. I mean, the relocation here, I think, of City Hall is a really powerful signal about the potential of the area, with the Royal Docks obviously undergoing a profound and exciting transformation. Once London's gateway to the world trade, as I know you heard earlier and mentioned, today I think it's really re-emerging as a nationally significant business and visitor destination. And it's going to be a vital part of the capital's civic and cultural heart in the future, I think. Major developments are unlocking thousands of new and affordable homes and workplaces. There's significant investment in transport and the public realm, boosting connectivity, bringing new opportunities to the area and communities. And this is London's largest opportunity area. It's equivalent in size to central London, from Hyde Park to Tower Bridge. Nearly 500 hectares of land, 100 hectares of water, 12 miles of waterfront. And as the Mayor of London's largest land-led project, it can accommodate more than 40,000 jobs and 30,000 homes over the next 20 years. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that a new chapter in London's history is beginning to be written here. The Royal Docks is London's only enterprise zone, allowing business rates to be reinvested in the area, providing businesses with additional support and services. And the area is already an economic important centre for London, home to industry giants like Tate & Lyle, XL, London City Airport. The development of new, flexible and affordable workspace is crucial as well, alongside business support initiatives. We need to diverse the business space here, stimulating jobs and ensuring better retention of the wealth locally. And the Community Wealth Building Business Pledge, developed with Newham Council, aims to embed community wealth building principles into the everyday practices and long-term strategies of all local organisations, with commitments ranging from the fair treatment of staff and tenants to buying local and cutting carbon emissions. Paying a fair living wage is a crucial aspect of the pledge and at the heart of work to establish the Royal Docks as a living wage place, hopefully a beacon for sustainable and responsible businesses everywhere. In line with this, the Royal Docks team are today launching the second round of their internship programme, offering 12-month London living wage placements with businesses across the area to those aged 18 to 30. I think this is a terrific example of the tangible impact that development is having on the lives and prospects of local people. Working closely with existing communities, I think, has got to be at the heart of the approach to developing the Royal Docks, as it should be right across East London. This is the only way to enable good growth, making sure communities help to shape development in their area and also share in the benefits that it brings. So projects like East Bank have worked incredibly hard to ensure that partners, the BBC, Sadler's Wells, UCL, London College of Fashion, and of course the V&A, they've worked really hard to ensure that those partners have built strong and lasting relationships with the local people long before the doors of the new buildings have even opened. And this includes supporting initiatives like East Summer School and Careers Week to enable local children to learn about anything from archaeology to shoe design and to help them make informed choices about their future. LLDC's Good Growth Hub is connecting local people with businesses on and around Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. It's providing skills, training, guidance to literally thousands of local people. And Build East is offering employer-led training programs to help local people to access construction apprenticeships with capacity for over 500 learners a year. So I think, to conclude, taken collectively, I think these initiatives and the new developments that sit behind them will have a truly transformative effect on the lives of thousands of Londoners and on the shape of our city for decades to come. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to keep working together to ensure that the incredible growth across East London provides the very best opportunities for Londoners and leaves a positive and sustainable legacy for future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jules. Oh, I can see myself now. That's alarming. I'll stop looking. It's break time now. Back, please, at 11:30 for another really fantastic panel. Please help yourself to tea and coffee and enjoy the new building. And thank you again for joining us today. Thank you very much for joining us again. I hope you enjoyed the coffee and the pastries if you're with us in person, but you at least got to get a coffee break if you're at home. Really excited to introduce our next panel session for today, Unlocking Growth. So today we're going to be talking about the shared vision for the east of the city as we try to make the most of those opportunity areas that Deputy Mayor Jules Pipe was telling us about before the breaks. How we make the most of the opportunities from infrastructure and investment in public transport, of course, a complex and contested area at the moment, how communities are involved and given a voice in the evolution of these areas, and how do we unlock the potential of the Thames just behind us here today as a means not just for transport, but for recreation, hospitality and culture. And I cannot think of a better day really to be thinking about the potential of the Thames because it looked absolutely beautiful on my way here today. Just a reminder to those of you who are joining us remotely to please log on to Slido and submit any questions to the panel for the Q&A at the end. I'm only going to say this twice more. The number is 796 780. So it's a great pleasure now to introduce Claudette Forbes, Director at CAF Consulting Limited, who will introduce her panel for this session. Thank you, Claudette.
Thank you. You may applaud. Yes, so thank you very much. I'm just going to open up for us this afternoon. I've got all these bits, iPads and wires, so bear with me as I get used to all the technology. Today, this panel discussion will be looking at visionary stuff for East London, the new vision for East London. And I just want to say, by way of introducing myself, Claudette Forbes, I started off my career in East London 30 odd years ago when there was a visionary chief executive of Newham had this idea that we might run a Channel Tunnel rail link through Stratford. The Thames Gateway was established. All of those things, and here we are today. It's really magnificent. Now we even have City Hall here. The first time I've been to this site, it's incredible coming into Victoria Dock. But without further ado, let me introduce our panelists for this particular session. Alistair Gale from the Port of London Authority, you want to come and join us. Beck Seeley from Lend-Lease. Councillor Darren Rodwell, who is the leader of Barking and Dagenham Council. Thank you for joining us. And last but certainly not least, we have Britannia Moulton from Sadler's Wells. And I just want to start off a bit with our panel. So I've just sort of mentioned a little bit about some visionaries from all those decades ago. I just want to dwell on that idea about the new vision for East London, what it can be in the future. And I'm really kind of interested that we have a cultural institution here on the stage who are very active now in East London. And I wonder whether, Britannia, you could say something about why Sadler's Wells is here and what that has to do with the vision for East London.
Sure. So some of you may know Sadler's Wells. We're based in Islington currently, and there's been a theatre in Islington called Sadler's Wells since 1683. So it's a very established name. And we focus on dance. So we're a dance theatre, and we focus on dance of all different kinds. So, ballet is one form of dance that people know probably the best, but we also deal with hip hop, flamenco, tango, Kathak, every kind of dance. And we're looking at the new forms, the new things that are going on with those dance styles. And we're not looking back, we're really looking forward is our mission. And so one of the reasons we wanted to look to build a new theatre was because dance doesn't have that much infrastructure in this country. So traditionally, theatre has had, if you like, much more backing in this country, and dance has sort of played a poor cousin. And the auditorium at Sadler's Wells, we've got two auditoria there, one that's 1,500 seats, so it's a large-scale venue, and we've got a studio theatre that seats about 180. What we're missing, and what the country is missing, is a mid-scale space for dance that's made for dance, because you have different needs. And so in East London, we're building a 550-seat auditorium for mid-scale dance works. And that means that we'll be able to connect with different different programs from all over the world that we can bring to London for dance at that scale. And similarly, we can take those works that we create in Stratford out to the world and out to the rest of the country that have more theatres of that scale. So it's a really important part of the new infrastructure that will mean that dance can, travel to more places and reach more people. And we're really keen and happy that we can do that in East London and really do our bit to, encourage the sort of regeneration of this part of London and offer more opportunities to local people. So our new theatre is going to open at the end of 2023, next year. And in the run-up to that, we've been working for some years now with local schools. We're working with local dance organisations. English National Ballet is local now. East London Dance, who've been here for many, many years. So we've been working with those people to design programmes for local people on the way up to our opening, so that, if you like, we don't land like a spaceship, that we have some connectivity with local people before we arrive, and that, those connections then work, and we'll have our opening and we'll be rooted in local communities. And the first production we're going to have at the new venue is a community project that Vicky Abokwe will be designing with local people, and that will be our opening production. So we're very excited about that.
Thank you so much. I don't think all the way back when I was working in Stratford all those decades ago, that we had the idea of any dance organisation like Sadler's Wells being there, or the V&A and all of that. So I just wondered if any of our other panellists would like to comment on the vision for East London. You're all active within the area. Perhaps, Councillor, you'd like to talk about from a Barking and Dagenham perspective.
Okay, so let's talk about it from an East London Barking and Dagenham perspective. I remember going into the corporation 2 days into being leader, when they were congratulating themselves about how they supported East London in Dalston. And it was a great and a good, and I thought, fantastic. It made no difference to my community. And I told them so. And it's fair to say it's great what's happening with Sadler's Wells. But I want to let you know that 30 years ago, I danced on the A13. Fact, because I had a dance club. In fact, I had the biggest dance organisation in Essex. Why? Because actually we've always had culture in Barking and Dagenham. We've also always had culture in East London. My culture links into the football I watch, to the dancing I do with my friends. My culture links into the arts that I see, the young people that are aspiring to change their lives. Diversity comes from Barking and Dagenham. So I don't need other people's culture. I need the evolution of our culture into a place where people can access it and actually feel part of it. And you talked about spaceship, and I smiled. Because actually, that's the problem with the Olympic Park. It hasn't got any connection to the culture. It's a big, expensive piece of infrastructure, but it's still a spaceship. The haves can land on there, the have-nots can't. If you wear your West Ham shirt, you're not allowed into Westfields. That's not inclusivity. That's actually a gated community, just because I happen to support a particular football club. So I made a point that I never go to Westfields anymore, because I'm proud of my culture and I'm proud of my place. And let me tell you something about culture. If the people of Barking and Dagenham hadn't stood up against the BNP, all this would have been for nothing. Because the only thing the world would have known us for is to have the first far-right council in London. That was only a decade ago. Today, my council is the most diverse and representative in London. I have every part of the world in my borough, and they believe in what we're doing collectively. So I find it amusing when we talk about culture, because every place has culture because it has community. We can build all the bricks and mortar, but without hearts and minds, you can't have a community. That, to me, is the culture of East London. We stood up against the fascists back in the day in Cable Street, and we did it again in 2010. So I'm really pleased about the culture I come from, and I'm proud of it. I just wish some people would actually respect the culture that I'm part of.
So there's a lot about inclusivity I'm hearing there. And who can argue against that, right? So, you know, let's look at this vision. Let's look at how inclusive we can be in engaging with communities and all of that. Any thoughts from one of the other panelists here?
Yeah, sure. Okay. I think
Beck.
I think Darren hit on the challenge facing everyone, really, which is how you actually do have an inclusive community and you actually really showcase all the great things that exist in communities that I agree with you don't necessarily get showcased. But I also feel that bringing new things like Sadler's Wells can actually help amplify things that are already there and give people new opportunities and new experiences. Yeah. And that, you know, is probably what we'll all hear about this morning, because that's a tricky balance to get right, if there's such a word as right with it. But I think if we look at East London and the opportunity, you know, just outside here, everyone's commenting on like, what a fantastic view all the way through, then for everyone here, I'd hope that the opportunity to really take us forward into the next 20, 30, 40 years and see that mix come through, to see that culture that so passionately exists already move forwards yet more as new people do come in and as new things do come through and new opportunities, then to me, that's kind of like, you know, building a future culture and a future place and not losing what's there, because no one wants to do that, but it is okay for things to evolve.
Thank you very much.
Alistair. If I could just follow up on a couple of points. The first thing is, I suppose you might wonder, why is the Port of London Authority here? This used to be ours, and it used to be full of ships. So as a portman, I look at that and go, it's very nice, it's very pretty, but it's not actually working, if you like. So the first thing to do to reassure you is that the ships have not, they've left London, but they haven't left the Thames. They're further downriver, and the Thames is still home to the UK's largest port. We have been for the last 3 years. We lost it for about 20 years, but we're now the UK's largest port. I think the second reflection is coming back to the theme of inclusivity. The Thames, in terms of looking at the opportunity that exists for East London, the Thames runs right through the heart of it, and it's potentially a link. It could be described as a ditch or a grand divide, and I think we'll come to that in terms of crossings. But we have just been in the process of developing a river development framework, and absolutely central to that is access and inclusivity, so that all people, whatever background, have the opportunity to access the river, whether it's for work, it's for relaxation, it's for sport. And at the moment, I'm sorry to say that it isn't representative, but we are determined to put the building blocks in place that makes it more accessible for more people.
Thank you very much. There's some very, very interesting comments there. Some, you know, a little bit controversial as well. There's nothing wrong with a bit of controversy. I think there is something. I remember when Michael Heseltine had this vision of the Thames Gateway, and it was that the East should be as wealthy as the West, that the people in East London should have access to that wealth. And I see some of that kind of shifting. I would have put the challenge to those institutions. Come and move yourself east as well. So I think I think we can have both. I think we can have both new from established institutions, but also emphasizing what's here already. A lot of culture, as you quite rightly said, Darren. Thank you very much for that. So I'm going to move the question on. We've got the Elizabeth line opening and new river crossings. Darren, do you want to say a little bit more what you were referring to in terms of maximising the opportunities of those developments?
Of course. So connectivity is absolutely critical. And I think we have to reflect on the fact that we are in financially straitened times, but nevertheless, cross-river connectivity remains really important. And the important thing is to find the right solution at the right place at the right price. So rather than very expensive bridges, which, by the way, have quite a significant impact on either side of the river in terms of the land take, instead, there is technology that exists and could be turned at a relatively cheap price compared to bridges if you have cross-river ferries electric ferries which run on a very frequent basis, which are for pedestrians and for cyclists. And that I was talking to somebody earlier on about light freight. Light freight is an area where the river can really come into its own in the coming years, because we've all, to a certain extent, we've been predisposed over the last 2 years to buy more online. You can use the river more for those deliveries. But I think this point, low cost, low environmental impact, frequent cross-river ferries could make a major difference in terms of economic opportunity for people. Because if you live in a riverside community, if you've got a circle around through which you can go for jobs, you've got half a circle. You can only go, if you're on the south, you can only go south and sort of along the riverbank. If you put that river crossing in, then you've got the opportunity to go to North Bank as well, and the sphere in which you can seek employment grows. So it's relatively small, but I think it could be transformative and something that could be delivered relatively quickly, serving, for example, Canary Wharf to Rotherhithe, maybe Barking Riverside to Thamesmead, and so on.
So am I to take it that you're not in favour of the Silvertown Tunnel? What's your view on it?
I think, well, there's a tricky question for you.
I could not ask the question.
I think Silvertown Tunnel are doing good things in that they're bringing some of the kit in for doing the tunnel by river. I think it's the question, the right crossing at the right place for the right price. We need more connectivity. Whether or not Silvertown Tunnel is the right solution, I think it's probably not for me necessarily to judge, and it's probably too late anyway, because I think they're well advanced with the construction.
Right. So, Darren, is your local authority, you're not one of those that have just come out against Silvertown Tunnel, are you? Do you have a view on it at all?
Yeah, I have a view that East London has been invested in for, well, since Victorians. So there is 22 bridges from Tower Bridge going west, connecting London together. In the east, there are 2. And if you want to include our friends in Dartford, who will tell me they're not a London borough, but hey, actually, then you can make it number 3 with the Queen Elizabeth Bridge. Now, the truth of the matter is, though, is that acceptable when you think that East London, North East, East and South East are going to build the size of Amsterdam? What other city would run on one train line, would run on a couple of ferries? And I agree with the ferries, by the way. I think we should have a ferry going from Riverside over to Thamesmead. I think it's massive. But then I also believe that the Lower Roding River, there should be a bridge. There once was, all the way back to Roman times, would you believe? But we took it out a few years ago. And actually that would then link us in to Crossrail. So I have a London borough that doesn't have Crossrail in its borough. Yeah, I'm going to build the size of York. So if we're going to talk about infrastructure, we need to look at the whole. How do we utilise the river? And I'm really proud to say that just after the election, I will be hopefully going on a boat with many young people in my borough for the first Thames Clipper. I won't talk about U-boats down the Thames. So I always use Thames Clipper. I can't use Uber boat. Sorry, it just doesn't work in my psyche. So it's about trying to deliver what residents need. So let's add up what residents actually need. We have a great rail line. It was spoken about earlier. Someone doesn't look old enough to be working here 30 years ago. But that train line gets a train every 40 minutes. So why have we not done HS1 domestic? HS1 domestic could be Ebbsfleet, Purfleet, Barking, Stratford International, King's Cross. Do that. You've just opened up a whole area of housing to the 3 major stations of Fenchurch Street, Liverpool Street, and King's Cross, St Pancras. The infrastructure is already there. We just haven't put the investment in. Now, that doesn't mean that's just done in isolation. It means we've got to have a whole cocktail of different interventions so in East London can build the size of Amsterdam. Because if you don't do that, we can't. And places from Tower Hamlets all the way through to Purfleet will suffer. We will be building the problems of tomorrow, today, if we don't have the right infrastructure. So we need national bodies to understand what it is we need to build the excellence that we want to see, with the opportunities, with world-class facilities coming in to the whole of the East London area.
Thank you. I mean, you put your point forward very, very powerfully. I agree with you. I think looking at the bridges, a map of all the bridges across the river really starkly shows you where East London has been positioned for so long. If we don't get the rail infrastructure in, you know, there'll be this over-reliance on cars. And I'm thinking about the Silvertown Tunnel again, just in terms of how do we overcome the air quality issues?
Well, first of all, you've got to have electric cars. That means you've got to make sure you've got the right infrastructure in to provide for those electric cars. We can't pretend people are not going to have cars for the next 15 to 20 years. They are. You know, if you live in outer London, you've got to have a car if you really want to move around our great city. It's all right if you're in the square mile. It's all right if you're on the inner London ring. But the outer London, you've got to have vehicles. So what we need to do is make sure that the infrastructure, so give you, for instance, this is about ambition, right? We are so ambitious in East London. So why can't we have solar farms on our roofs that then connect in to a substation under our feet? All the technology is there. That means it's dual fuel, so we don't have to wait on the actual infrastructure of the state, because we know it ain't going to work. So we can actually do it ourselves, but we need government to release the opportunity to allow us to do that. We all want to do it. All the London boroughs want to work, and it don't matter what political persuasion we are. So the car will be with us. We do have to facilitate whilst restricting its use, but you can only restrict its use if the infrastructure is there for alternatives. And actually at the moment in East London, those alternatives are not there clearly enough for people to be able to have an active lifestyle choice. And it's about choice.
Thank you very much for that. So we're hearing a lot about East London's infrastructure needs and things like that. Beck, I just want to turn to you. I mean, your Lend-Lease is very active in East London. What do you see as some of the big challenges for the area? And what's Lend-Lease? What is your involvement in this? What are you seeing as Lend-Lease as a solution to some of those?
I think we've probably already talked about infrastructure. I do think seeing is believing and using it. So I think Crossrail, once it's open, will make a huge difference, because people will be able to kind of get their head around the time difference it can make. Appreciate Darren's point, it's not going everywhere. And Crossrail isn't the answer to everything, but it will make a big difference. I think the other challenges that we see are around sort of thinking through the world we're in right now, post-COVID, the opportunity that creates. And I guess, you know, the big things and the big changes in the next 20, 30 years, I think we maybe need to adjust our minds to how that works, in that it's probably not that everyone will be going every day on a commuting from one part to the other. There's going to be much more flexible demands. So things like, you know, just how you use the existing infrastructure and then what new infrastructure bolts onto that. So things like, you know, TfL are working quite a lot, I think, on timed arrivals, timed departures, and how that goes through, so ticketing and user management. And also, I think what we kind of, maybe it gets talked about a lot, but for Lend-Lease it's absolutely critical, is the infrastructure that goes with homes and jobs, so public realm, public spaces, and areas that you can actually live and work in and use that aren't necessarily your home and they aren't necessarily your workplace, so the areas in between. Which it's interesting, we were doing Lend-Lease as a, you know, as everyone probably knows, for good or bad, a large global developer. And we work in many cities, and there was a piece of work done on what makes a city and its population feel better and happier about where they live and where they work. And interestingly, across the world, the quality of public realm and the linkages between places comes up really consistently. If it's not the first, it's the second. So how you kind of connect and put infrastructure in is one thing, but what it looks and feels like and how that reflects on you as a user, all types of users. So things like, for example, you know, the inclusivity of that, whether we've actually catered for the fact that, you know, elderly population, that's a different use category, all those things is really the key determinant of whether you achieve what you set out to.
Yes.
So I think that's what everyone collectively, you know, Lend-Lease bangs on about it. And I think, you know, we absolutely try to live and breathe it, but it's not one person's responsibility. It really does have to come together.
Yeah, yeah, I can see some panelists nodding. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Alistair, perhaps?
Yeah, just thinking about it's not one person's responsibility. I think at the PLA, one of the things we can do, we're uniquely placed to bring people together to talk about the opportunity and the potential of the river, but we can't realize the value of it. We can't make the best of it by ourselves. We need partners like Lend-Lease, partners like Barking and Dagenham, and so on. And so my entreaty to everybody in the room is we're currently consulting on Thames Vision 2050, which is this river development plan. If anybody in the room wants to engage with that, please go to our website, have a look at it, and join the conversation about how we can make the most of the river. And just to pick up on what Beck was mentioning in terms of that connectivity piece, traveling by river, and as Darren mentioned earlier on, can be really transformative. I think that the Barking Riverside development and that being river connected, that's the kind of community that you want to see in the future, where the river is properly integrated, both in terms of travel, it can be the way that the goods come in for the local supermarket, and it can be also the place that people play and they relax as well. So I think the river can really be integrated into the future of East London.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to now move on to another subject. So here we are, and you know, this was, you know, parts of East London, some of the poorest areas in the country, and we have a government levelling up agenda, which is not London focused.
Yeah.
Some might say rightly so, I don't know. How are we going to get policy attention to get us, you know, to get us to where we want to be, our ambitions for this part of London? Answers on a postcard, panelists.
We did that last week going to Mippin.
Oh, you went to Mippin, did you?
Yeah, of course I did.
Yeah.
That's where the business goes from the globe, so we have to be there.
Right.
So London's councils, supported by the Mayor, the Corporation and London and Partners, with the NLA, have set up something called Opportunity London. And that is actually a space where you can go on the website and it will show you all 32 boroughs. It will show you the aspiration of all 32 boroughs, because there's no such place as London. There's a load of villages that interconnect that we call a place called London, but it's every place is different. You know, people won't understand why I'm so passionate about my place, because it's the place where women's rights has always been at the fore. It stopped slavery. We won the World Cup for the country. So it's all right. You know, it's really important that we have that pride of place. And it's so important about what you said about connecting. The only problem is the government's too busy partying to actually look at the real issues of what's going on. London is the powerhouse of the country. Whether they like it or not, it is. So to restrict funding to the biggest organism of the place to deliver for the income of the country is a ridiculous policy to be in. And it's happening. Whether we want to talk about it publicly or not, you know, if you'd have been at Mippin last week, Paris had a larger stand than London and the UK. I mean, how embarrassing. We are Great Britain. We've got a world-connected city that has the best of everything in this city. Yet we weren't prepared to show it off. So I think we shouldn't be shy. I think you might have noticed I'm not shy in coming forward. We shouldn't be shy about London. We operate at 3 levels. We operate at an international level, and our fight is against places like New York, Hong Kong, Berlin. Yeah, we have to attract the world, the global best. We need Sadler's Wells to be part of that cultural connection. We've got Lend-Lease, who are Australian, coming here because they want to do business with us. Yeah, but we use the history of the ports to make sure people understand we've been here a long time. We're good old money. At the same time, though, right, we also operate at UK level. We are the gateway to the UK economy. So we need to show that off and show our partners in the core cities up and down the country that we are partners to them, not adversarial to them.
Okay.
And then lastly, we need to actually improve. I have the poorest in London, in my borough. They deserve the best. I want Zone 1 buildings in Zone 4. I want the right infrastructure, and I want the job opportunities with the culture. That should be a must for the greatest city in the world.
There you go, Sadler's Wells. You got mentioned there. He wants you. You know,
That's very good.
Yeah. Do you see yourself in any of this debate around levelling up? And what,
Definitely. I mean,
yeah.
the Nadine Dorries has just announced that Arts Council funding that currently goes to London should be going to the regions, and so that's, you know, there's a 15% cut in London funding, so that's going to have a real impact, and it may well have a real impact on Sadler's Wells. So, and what, you know, what we can achieve. Now, you know, of course, I think all of the London cultural organisations, you know, want to have real impact all over the country. And I think there is a, I don't think the government currently really appreciate how much London organisations do for the rest of the country. And that's a pity. And we all want to do our bit to address levelling up. It's just how we do that. And the speed at which they want to introduce this is quite challenging.
I mean, some of us might argue that we've been trying to level up in London, you know, different parts of London for, you know, for so long. That's what that most of.
Can I just come back on that?
Yeah.
Arts England, 95% of the money that goes to London goes to 5 boroughs, and they're mostly to institutions that work outside of London. So whilst they're saying they're not going to invest that money into the arts in London, actually it affects the whole UK. And I've actually asked the Arts Council to look at what that really does mean for the country, because I'm on their board, believe it or not. I am cultured in some respects. So, but it is really important that we understand this money isn't going to local communities, it's going to international institutions that actually do a lot of work outside of London.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I think we now know that you're cultured. You're dancing. I'm just coming away with such an impression of you. Thank you so much for that. Now, the time is now to open up to the audience for questions. And we do actually have a question from Will Tuckley, who's Chief Executive of Tower Hamlets, looking all bashful there in the front. Do you want to give us your question? Go on. Floor them.
Thank you very much. Is that good?
Not yet.
Not very loud. Can you guys hear?
Well, we can hear, but
we can hear. So I'm Will Tuckley, I'm the Chief Executive of Tower Hamlets, and I want to go back to your first question, the question about inclusivity, because I think that's crucial to the vision for East London going forward. So in Tower Hamlets, we've had huge growth, absolutely huge.
Yeah.
Third largest GBA in the country. And that has had an impact on our economic prospects. So that's better. So our employment rate used to be way below the London average. It's now at the London average. But I think it's fair to say we've made less progress socially and culturally. So, for example, in relation to housing, we've built more affordable housing and more housing than anywhere else in the country, yet we still have the highest child poverty rate because of housing costs. So my question really is, how do we make sure that going forward, growth reflects local populations' culture and social needs, that they recognise that as their growth, and that the change and disruption is worthwhile for them?
There you go, the $60 million question. Facing all of us working in this field. I'm not a panel member, so I don't have to answer that. Who would like to put their hand up to that?
Well, let them
go for it, Alistair.
I suppose my reflection on that is really, it's going to be a river-centric answer, and that may not surprise you. I think if we can make it so that people have a greater connection with and ownership of the river, then they will then get to see it as an opportunity, as a place to work, and as a place to, and as a way to travel, as I've said before. But I think the key thing is that connection and how you make that come about. And I think one thing we shouldn't miss is the sheer scale of the opportunity in terms of investment. There's talk about a boatyard being built at the far end of the Royal Docks at Albert Island. There will be more ferries at Thames Clippers, not that boat company that you just mentioned a moment ago. They employ 400 people now. They're busy employing apprentices. They are making the connections that you want to see. And over time, as the river is used more for freight, for travel, and so on, I think that connection will be consolidated. And also, we're working with the Thames Skills Academy to ensure that people from different backgrounds who have traditionally accessed the river, that they get the opportunity to access it as well.
Thank you. And I would like to dwell on that question, but I've got loads of questions coming in from the people at home on their, or wherever they are on their technology. Is this on Zoom? But I would say, I mean, for me, the major issue is the affordability of housing, whether you want to buy or rent. I mean, unless we as a country just decide to change the way we do things, I think a lot of people will be excluded. But there,
again, sorry, on that,
questions
it's another piece of information people might not know. We spend, we get about £8 billion to build those homes that communities need. Most of us grew up in council housing in this room, even today. You might have bought it afterwards, but you grew up in it. So it's massively aspirational. And I live on the Becontree estate, the first of its kind, replicated. It has actually fueled good growth for the country. I just don't understand why government doesn't always see it. And we have this political bashing over it. I don't like the term social housing. I just don't agree with it because I remember it meaning that you weren't good enough to own your own home when the right to buy first come in. I agree with council housing because we're normally the people that make sure that people do well in society. It's councils, it's left to local authorities. But what's really important is £23 billion a year is spent on private landlords, giving them money for housing those that we should be housing. 23 billion, and we spend 8 billion building new homes. That says to me we've got a real problem about our values and what we should be doing in building the communities that are inclusive. And it doesn't matter if you're the cleaner to the chief executive of a council, you should be able to be neighbours. And at the moment, that's not being seen. And we've got to learn from that. We've got to learn from that because otherwise we all suffer.
Thank you. We've got less than 4 minutes left. So I'm going to ask our panelists to try and succinctly answer. I'm going to ask the first question is, I'm going to have to put it to you, Beck, first. Opportunity areas in London are often geared towards large companies and developers like Lendlease. How can we ensure that individuals and small companies are able to be the primary drivers of growth? How does that make you feel?
I guess there's a couple of things that spring to mind. Lendlease is a large company, and with that comes an ability to invest at scale and kind of drive change at scale. I completely get, though, that can be seen as quite adversary to some people. I think where we've really focused and continue to focus is Lendlease doesn't do everything itself. So all the investment that Lendlease makes, a huge amount of that goes back into partnering with SMEs and delivering in partnership with a range of organisations throughout the community. We focus hugely on the amount of spend that goes within the direct community, because I think to many of Darren's points, it is really challenging when you are bred and born in the community and you feel like, this is happening to you, and what are you getting for it? And therefore, being able to offer opportunities in jobs, employment, training, and not just construction jobs, because I think the world has moved on. It's about long-term jobs and skills that give you careers and give you skills that are going to equip you for the next 30, 40 years. Then Lendlease's focus has been very much around how our whole sort of ecosystem, to use a word of that supply chain, really works, and we put that money back into local organisations. And that means some things that you maybe don't expect an organisation like a Lendlease to do. So, for example, in our construction world, some of the things we do, we partner with SMEs who've got a really innovative idea, but they can't afford the investment to see whether it will work. So we will, go, I don't know, 75, 25, whatever it is on the investment to see if it'll work. We always want to make sure that they've got a stake in it being successful. That's good business. But I think trying to partner and bring through SMEs and the local enterprise that is there and is really powerful, for me, that's a core part of the model. And I do appreciate people would say, well, that's easy to say, but it really does happen, but it takes a lot of effort.
Thank you.
And
we've got such a short amount of time. And
I know, but this is so important. This is so important.
Okay.
A train comes into East London in Barking, okay? It's connected to the whole of Europe, the whole of Asia, and the whole of Africa. 80% of the world's economies, yeah? We need to be ready for that in East London, because that's the real powerhouse that we're going to be able to utilise that. And collectively, we've got to do that job.
Shout out to Barking and Dagenham. And any questions from the floor? Got one more question, and I'm going to just take your pick who wants to answer this. Can we utilise rail property for housing as well as the infrastructure that we need?
Yes.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That question just answered itself, doesn't it? That was more of a suggestion than a question. We've run out of time. We've got 10 seconds left to say thank you very much. And thank you to my panelists, Britannia, Darren, Beck, and Alistair. Great session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You want my... There you go.
That's lovely. I'm just going to take the mic.
Ken.
Come back.
When I'm on. Thank you so much. Oh dear. I thought we were done with that. Thank you so much to Claudette and colleagues for a really fascinating panel session just then. We are just getting our next panel mic'd up and ready to go. Really interesting last panel session of the day, looking outwards from here in East and South East London. How can partners within the wider South East collaborate more closely to address shared strategic growth challenges, such as building new homes, infrastructure, and growing sustainably? One last reminder from me, please log into Slido and submit any questions for the Q&A at the end. The number is 796-780. And now I'm delighted to introduce Lisa Taylor, Director at Coherent Cities and Executive Director at Future of London, to introduce her panel. Thank you so much, Lisa.
Come on up, everyone. Oh, and I'm on. Hello. Come on up. We're not doing the one at a time thing because we want you to have all the time with this panel as possible. Anywhere you want to sit now. Have a seat. Good. All right, we have the penultimate slot before we get going, and I have been given a poll to give you all as well. Before we get into that, just a quick introduction of the panel. You've got their bios in your packs or on your phones if you're tech savvy. I'll go from my left. We've gone boy, boy, girl, girl, girl. So this is kind of a nice weighting. We have John Lewis, Executive Director at Thamesmead for Peabody, massive development, obviously, across the river. We have Councillor Jeremy Kite, MBE, call me Jeremy. Yes, we've gone through that bit already, so that's all very good. Dartford Council, who will be talking about being at the nexus of London, Essex, and Kent, but also the far end of Kent, an interesting place to be. We have London Assembly member for London Wide, Sakina Sheikh, who has an expertise, so we know about 6 years worth, certainly, in climate change, and also holds the Regen brief for the Labour group. And finally, we have Shona Manson, who is culture lead, and also you have the longest and most impressive title, Thames Estuary Partnership Corridor, the Thames Estuary Production Corridor Partnership Board Co-Chair and Assistant Director for the Culture Group at the GLA. So she wins, she wins. Anyway, it's very good to see all of them and to see all of you. And as I say, I have been asked to give you a bit of a poll to get things started. The question that'll be on Slido, I don't know if it's going to come up on the screen or not, which would be great, is in which of these policy areas do we most need to see increased collaboration between East London and the wider Southeast? Basically, where do we need the most collaboration? And your choices are, will be coming up momentarily, are transport projects and commuter link investment, housing and planning, joint calls to increase government recognition of leveling up needs, i.e. lobbying, tackling climate change, and employment and opportunities. Now, Shona's pointed out at one point, she said, where is the question about our destination identity and our regional identity, which is a good one, and we'll get into that in discussion. So if you've got that, oh, you've already started answering, that's great. You've got the poll there, so 796780, you're starting to answer that. We'll take that down so we can have our chat, but do keep answering it on Slido, and you will have a chance, as before, to do Q&A on Slido also. I wanted to start with the question I haven't really heard answered yet, which is how are the working patterns changing this relationship between central London, East London, Kent, Essex, this whole region that we've got. Obviously, there have been some changes. Are they coming back to normal or not? I'm actually going to start with Jeremy in terms of what are you seeing? Are you seeing any pattern changes in terms of actual commuting and residents or in terms of traffic through?
Well, the bad news is I have absolutely no unique insights into pandemic at all. I
think my mic's a bit too loud.
There's an interesting figure, which is that the busiest day on the Dartford River crossing, and the Dartford River crossing is what most of you know about Dartford, apart from Mick Jagger, but the busiest day ever on the Dartford River crossing was post-COVID. So I think people are starting to move again. My hunch is it's changing the way people are behaving within their work patterns. I think the headquarters will come back. I think the towns and cities will always be towns and cities, but I do think that people are getting used to hybrid working and flexible working. And that's going to have an impact on our local towns in terms of where they shop and eat and where the opportunities are. They'll be getting home earlier. They'll be doing more early evening, nighttime economy stuff. They'll be having more family time, leisure requirements. We've seen in Kent an awful lot of our public spaces have taken a battering during COVID. Very good news. That's exactly what they're for. But they've taken a battering of people using parks and using pathways and using their walks in the countryside. So, yeah, I think that's it. But I don't have any unique... I mean, we're going to get some data, aren't we? There's going to be data about this. Productivity is the thing that concerns me as to whether we've forgotten to be productive, if we ever were. But that might be the point at which we change.
That could be the question anyway. I did want to ask John as well, because Thamesmead obviously could be seen as the end of the line at Abbey Wood. There is some discussion about Crossrail going to Ebbsfleet, which is a bit Marmite, sort of a more dark Marmite than light Marmite, I'm not sure. But what's your feeling in terms of what's happening at Thamesmead? Are people staying home? Does it feel like a good thing what's happening now? Or
yeah, I think it's interesting. What I would say that the world of COVID definitely introduced was the need to have space around you. I think the idea of your doorstep living rather than what I would say the dormitory living, where it was like I sleep here and then I go somewhere else and have my whole lifestyle away from my home. That is the fundamental shift that not only have we seen and has been fully tested for 2 years, but I think is genuinely here to stay. So we've been very fortunate in Thamesmead, where we have an enormous amount of parks and lakes, access to the river. We've got an infrastructure already there that a lot of people who'd even lived there for 30 years didn't know existed because they had to go out and investigate. And what that's done is thrown a challenge straight back to us to make sure that we manage and look after all those places because people really, really value them. And I think if I stretch that comment further to East London generally, I think high density living that we can see outside here is also a little bit more challenged because I think the idea of just your internal space is not enough. And I do think when we look at some of the plans that were perhaps put in place just a few years ago, and certainly pre-COVID world, I do think we need to seriously consider whether we've got some of those designs right, given the way, as I wrote down a bit earlier, that quality of life has become a sort of a need, not a dream. And I think it's really important we take that on board, and we've learned that through the last 2 years, and I do think it's here to stay.
Thank you. Good points in there for anywhere that places are being developed or thought about. And I don't know if you guys have seen the Thamesmead Now is the website, right? If you've seen it lately, it's interesting because it's all about place. The one that talks about Southmere, being the sort of new first 130 homes and its sort of charter development going on, also talks about place. It's a really interesting way to shape it. And also the fact, I think there's the affinity too, the Peabody name is up quite prominently saying this is who we are and this is what we believe in, which is an interesting way to go about that. Sakina, I wanted to come to you on this question too. You have the regeneration thing. What are you thinking about the change in terms of patterns and places?
Yeah, well, thanks for your question, Lisa. And firstly, welcome to the new City Hall, everyone. I'm sure that's going to be a running theme throughout the sessions today. And I know that Jules will be speaking to you. It's so exciting to have you all here and people filling the space with ideas, with conversations, and hopefully visions for the future, especially as we transition out of the pandemic. I hope it didn't take you too long to get here, but once you get here, look at that view. So yeah, please keep coming back. It's really wonderful to have you all here. On the question of, how the pandemic has changed our living and what it means in terms of infrastructure and political priorities. Well, I think the first thing that I think the other panelists have touched on is the change to high streets and the idea of a 15-minute neighborhood and where you live, and if you end up working from home, how do you ensure that within your life you can walk to a thriving high street, you can walk to a park, you can walk to your friend's house, there's safe cycle lanes, there's safe walking paths. So I think already what we're seeing is a change in people's perception of how they want to live their life. And particularly in London, I think that's really important because it's a beautiful, brilliant city, but it can be tough. It can be really busy. And sometimes, we have to fight for our neighborhoods to be reflective of what we can build as something that allows us to aspire to a high quality of life. So I think protecting our high streets, and that's something that our Mayor Sadiq has put really clearly as a political priority, particularly in the recovery ward. Another thing I'd say is about housing, and the pandemic has just simply shone a light on a problem that's been ongoing for a long time in the city and in the UK more broadly. Rents are so high that it made no sense for so many people to stay in London renting when they're working from home. It wasn't really a kind of productive use of their funds, and so we saw a lot of people leave London during the pandemic. How do we bring them back? Part of me wants to say, let's build excellent infrastructure, transport infrastructure, continue to build excellent infrastructure so that people can live out of London and commute into work. But at the same time, if it's the housing crisis that's stopping people staying in London, then that's a problem. So I think rent caps, for instance, is something that we've been talking about a long time from City Hall, and I hope that national government's listening, because I think as we transition out of the pandemic and we want to get people to come back to London, we need to make sure that the housing market meets their needs. And forgotten to be productive, I think, was a quote. Well, I think maybe redefining what productivity looks like instead is what I'd go with, because I think actually being able to go to your local parks, actually being able to have a thriving social life, actually being able to connect with people. And that's why, for instance, alfresco dining was something that people got very excited about. And all credit to the government, I don't often give it to them, but they actually took out a consultation last year and sort of said, do we want these outside structures where you can eat outside alfresco dining to be made more permanent? And we responded from the Labour group and said, yes, please, because actually it gives you that kind of space to reshape some of the culture in London as well, so that people can connect and begin to kind of, tackle the mental health crisis that will inevitably be continuing to unfold as we do recover from the pandemic. So lots of exciting things happening. And yeah, look forward to working with people to make it happen.
Thanks very much. Touching on a lot of that in terms of where you work from, how you work. Shona, you brought up the question before we were talking about infrastructure in the prep room, about digital infrastructure, and actually the support that people can stay in Dartford, in Kent, in Essex, not just be in London as well as anything else. What do you see happening? Are you optimistic? What do you think?
Yeah, hi everybody, and hello at home, and it's great to see. I just wanted to add 2 points on changing behaviours when I have a microphone. Hey, thanks so much. Hi everyone and at home. Just 2 quick points on the changing behaviours front. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about Thames Estuary Production Corridor later, but the clue's in the name. It's all about creative production and becoming a kind of world-leading ecosystem for that across the region. And 2 points I just wanted to make around changing behaviours. The first is that, as well as COVID, and clever people across the city, including at Centre for London, are helping us think about where those behaviours might end up. We also have to remember the changes that Brexit has already brought. Really, really important from a production perspective. So, on labour and skills, for example, the British Fashion Council estimated that of 13,500 workers in London garment factories, 87.5% of the workforce was from the EU. So it's a huge consideration for us to lay across that. And also changing values in consumerism. So as well as where people live and work, and they are making ethical choices around work as well, they're making ethical choices about where they spend their money. So again, that impacts on fashion industry and on production. So it's a complicated future to look forward to, and there are lots of opportunities around that. But I'm really glad you raised the point around digital. I mean, there are two points that I'm sure will come up time and again today. Digital is one, skills is another. So 2 of the growth industries in the Thames Estuary Production Corridor area, so that's across East London, South Essex and North Kent, Our film and TV production, which we've seen a huge growth and boom through COVID, driven by changes in consumption again, and fashion networks. Now, digital is absolutely critical to both of those. If you are a high-end TV and film production area, you are producing digital content that needs to move swiftly around the world. So digital infrastructure, connectivity is going to be absolutely crucial. And I'll leave the skills point for now, but it'd be great to come back to them.
Okay, thanks for that. We've been talking about culture in a way as well, digital, live, cultural industries. I want to get into it's not on the list, sorry, the slightly thorny issue of car culture, because you need it to get around Kent and Dartford. We're again it in London. Sorry, that was really loud. But there's a question of how do you balance the two? What are you guys working on right where you're based in terms of trying to reduce car use, and what are you seeing in the wider Kent?
Well, Dartford has a great car culture. We just can't go anywhere. We are congested beyond belief, and it's congestion's our problem. And that's why, I mean, it's interesting, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, a leader of Dartford wouldn't have been invited to a forum like this talking about London. It wasn't our issue. Now, things like the Lower Thames Crossing and all those other interconnected things, as London continues to grow and become a major, or continue to be a major international influence in the world and starts to move outwards, places like Dartford are in the front line of that, and we bring it on. Let's bring it on. So your infrastructure issues are our infrastructure issues. I don't think any longer the notion that somehow places like Dartford are more car reliant. I think we've got to work really hard. During lockdown, my vice was e-cycling. I took up an e-bike for the first time. I had to find someone that was capable of handling a 21 stone bloke, and there aren't that many bikes that could do it. I found one. I've lost 4 stone, put half a stone back on, but I've lost 4 stone.
For that,
and what it's made me realise is that actually that you can get places. There is an alternative strategy. There is a way of dealing with it. Now, of course, it doesn't deal with every issue. I think being anti-car is not helpful in our society, but certainly having the opportunity to do other things. For us, though, we would just like to be able to move in Dartford. The Lower Thames Crossing is so important to us, and the benefits of the Lower Thames Crossing. And I've got a big concern about climate change. And I have to say, building new roads sounds like counterintuitive, but if those new roads and new tunnels and crossings are more environmentally sound than the ones they replace or go before them, I think it's worth doing. So yeah, I mean, let's get people out of cars, of course, but I think the COVID pandemic has done more for that in the last 2 years than probably policy has done for 40. And let's try and build on that. Yeah, absolutely. And I should keep on cycling.
Yeah, we should all keep on cycling. Thank you. And walking, those of you who walk. John,
Yeah.
Thamesmead, yeah.
I mean, an interesting one is it was born out of an era where it was quite car dependent. There's no question about that. And anyone who knows the area, it's got large dual carriageway that sort of divides up the whole area in half, which we would love to see change. But I suppose that the big thing is in terms of the existing infrastructure, we're really working on connectivity. I think the statistic says something like 3% of journeys are taken on bikes in Thamesmead, which basically means hardly any at all. And probably some of them are mainly Peabody staff, actually, if they've been in the in the mix on that. But it's really difficult to get around because there was this assumption that cars were used. There aren't even the traditional pavements to follow in some parts of the estate. It's actually difficult to walk from A to B if you don't know the area. So just some really simple things about introducing decent infrastructure at a local level will help to address that. Plus the new schemes, of course, will have less requirement for parking over time to meet local council policies, which we absolutely are very supportive of. But then as we move towards the waterfront and the large plan there, that is all around public infrastructure. So that will be hopefully a 15,000 home development on the water side, which will be predicated on the DLR arriving, which you've heard a lot about today. But we're taking the line very clearly with our partner Lendlease on this, that without the DLR, this isn't happening. And that's the sort of commitment we can give, which means we can then move towards a zero carbon environment to live in, which is fundamentally important to what we're saying in our emerging sustainability plan. So these are absolute planks of what we have to do to achieve this. But it takes time and it's an adjustment. But as long as you've got the alternatives, Elizabeth Line, DLR, better connectivity, I think people are really willing to jump out of their cars because it's an easier option. As you say in Dartford, I think most people there would love to be able to not use their car, but they haven't got the alternatives, have they? And that's really the challenge. And I think also one of the most effective things for getting people out of cars is sadly what's happening now, where I spent over £100 filling up my car yesterday with one tank, and that is a real shock.
Yeah.
And I think that will drive people out of their cars should this be continuing.
A stick that is beyond our control, but also in a way has almost a terrible silver lining to it. All right, thanks for that. I'm going to come back to you with the climate change piece on that. I'm wondering about nudge behavior in terms of that, but also I'm thinking about, what does, the Greater London Authority think about climate change in terms of beyond its red line? How are you working on that?
I mean, it's a great question, and I think Stig was recently elected or nominated as chair of the C40 Cities Network, which is a global network bringing together leaders of major cities to look at how their climate action can be coherent. So London is very much in the much wider picture internationally in terms of our climate action. And I think it's important, therefore, also to put the climate emergency in terms of how we take action in London in that international context of the fact that, climate change, it is an emergency. It has been for many years. Floods on our high streets, fires in our forests is a very recent and new phenomenon for people in the UK. But actually, in global south countries like Bangladesh or in Kenya, this has been ongoing for decades. And so it's, I'm pleased that there's a kind of clear, coherent political priority now on climate change. And London and the UK need to meet our responsibility in terms of, behaving appropriately in how we adapt our infrastructure, how we but a kind of clear and coherent priority on building public infrastructure, public transport infrastructure. But let's be really clear, the government needs to do the heavy lifting when it comes to climate change. We need to stop subsidizing fossil fuel companies. You can't with one hand continue to subsidize fossil fuel companies and uphold an industry that isn't really part of the future, let's be really honest. Mark Carney, the previous governor of the Bank of England, said investments in fossil fuels are becoming stranded assets. They are risky because this is a market that is not part of the future before we even get into the ethics and the morals of climate change. So I want to see heavy lifting from the state. And I think doing that will provide the balance that our colleagues have talked about so that people don't feel like we're anti-car and people don't feel like the books are being balanced on the backs of the poorest. So don't get in your car, do more recycling, stop eating all beef. I mean, I think all of these things are good solutions, but it's not everyone's individual specific responsibility to solve climate change. It's about having a balance of individual action along with heavy lifting from the state so that people can be taken on a journey. I think if you can paint a picture to people about what a vision of a climate just future looks like, they'll be jumping on board. Think about that 15-minute neighborhood that we were talking about earlier. Great public infrastructure and transport that's properly subsidized by the state, thriving neighborhoods, outdoor seating, walking, parks, green spaces. A climate just future for everyone means we all flourish. So it makes total sense to use that as the framework when we talk about the priorities of our transport infrastructure, but it would be remiss of me as a Labour Assembly member to not talk about the government not giving TfL a proper funding deal because we need the money to be able to plan. It's basic governance. It's basic governance. You want a long-term transport strategy for one of the best cities in the world, give us a proper funding deal so we can actually get on with planning and delivering. So I think without that, we can't do all of these ambitions that we have. And so I hope the government's listening.
I'm sure they're somewhere watching online, I'm sure, if they're not here. The government, if you're here, the government, hello. It's a good point that who's responsible for what is really worth discussing with this group because we've got public, private, third sector here. In terms of the production corridor, it's not, is it a statutory body? It's not, right? It's just partnership. This is the question. I mean, duty to cooperate has died a death, probably a useful one. How are you guys managing with that? Do you think it's necessary to have something more formal? And I will bring this question to you guys.
It's a really interesting point to talk about that. So we've been on this journey for about 5 years now, and that has been a journey of cooperation, partnership, working through establishing genuine shared objectives and then piecing together the resource around that. And it has worked incredibly well, but we do need to formalize that governance. And we're right at the point with, all of our partners, like think about the complexity of it. We're working with 18 local authorities across the 3 areas. We are, we have the LEAP, the Thames Estuary Growth Board, the Southeast LEP, industry partners. It is a huge undertaking. And we have one dedicated post, which we fundraised for, funded by government at the moment, thankfully. And that is the glue that holds it all together. He's right here with us, Alex. And that's a huge weight to carry on your shoulders. So I think that there is a formality around who makes decisions. So it's absolutely important that that is an inclusive process, and we have to address that. We have to work well with that as we go into our next 5 to 25 years. But ultimately, I think there is a question around resource, which has to be considered in partnerships. You have to put resource behind that partnership in order for it to be equitable and to flourish. But we've been really successful with it. It can work.
As something less formal. That's interesting. Coming to that point too, and thinking a little bit in terms of housing, because for the longest time since I've been involved in this kind of work in London, it's been pushing housing out to the southeast, and it's been sort of stick tools, formal tools like the duty to cooperate. Now there's been a natural flow. As you say, oil and gas prices are changing. What's happening with car use? People are choosing to move away or stay in town. Do you need something more formal to say we will or we will not take your housing, London? What
No, spare us. Spare us from
Right,
new.
we can go now.
Spare us from new bloody bodies. I mean, we've got the structures here, and every time somebody, I mean, I'm old enough now to have been to launches of so many new visions, new groups, new ministers, new this, new that. Actually, every single time we launch something new, we move further and further away from the democratic oversight of the resident, the voter, the person, and the family at the heart of this, because you put somebody else in control. They have a new job title, they have a new thing. Collaboration is the key. We get on. I mean, I've never met another body that we wouldn't get on with in Dartford or collaborate with. And there was an issue about whether or not this works cross-party. Sure, it works cross-party. Of course it does, if there's a shared objective. The only person in local government I've never got on with is Darren Rodwell from Barking and Dagenham. But of course, he's not a real, I mean, Barking and Dagenham's not a real place. It's two places. We achieve everything that he does on one name. So he's the only person we don't get along with, is Rodwell. But we get along with everybody, and we get along fine. And so I don't think we need new bodies. We don't need new visions. We just need to agree what our agenda is. And if I just say one quick thing, I've listened to a lot, I came early and listened to a lot of the debate. Everybody talks about 30, 40 years of the planning, all this vision. I was blessed to be with when this vision began. Those of you who are old enough will remember there's a film called The Long Good Friday, starring Bob Hoskins. Do you remember the premise of The Long Good Friday, which was in 1980 and came about, obviously written 77, 78? The premise was there was a gangster who spotted the opportunities of the Thames Corridor, and he had a big yacht moored at Tower Hill, and instead of looking west, he looked east. And he gave this great speech. This is the future. This is the future of the Thames Corridor. The only difference, of course, the only difference in reality, of course, is that it's now being delivered by developers and not gangsters. So we know how that's different, isn't it? Yeah, that's different. So it's always been obvious, and depending on your faith, God did this to us. We're in this location. We have this amazing opportunity. The Romans started here. We've now got this amazing inheritance to make it happen, and we can collaborate, but we don't need artificial constructs. I will work with colleagues on this panel, Labour, Independent, anything. I'll work with anybody to deliver what's good for our residents. And I found that right across the family of local government, national government, to be honest with you.
Thank you. We got a little baby applause from Darren. Thank you, Darren.
A patronising round of applause.
There's no other kind. John, you are in all kinds of relationships. I mean, you've got
Expand on that a little bit.
You've got 2 boroughs. You're in a JV. It's a JV with Lend-Lease and so forth. You've just got a lot going on. You're negotiating in terms of the DLR coming in. How are you making that happen? I don't know if you want another organization layered on top of that, but how are you making that work?
Sort of the general comment, really. I think there can be a need for not necessarily formal bodies, but I think there can be a need for some infrastructure to harness people's views and opinions, because I think, I mean, hands up, I used to work for English Partnerships many years ago, and I think we had moments of arrogance where you'd march around the country saying, we know what to do, and you sort of bounce in and suggest things. And what we learned through that process, which is why it was probably disbanded, was the need for no imposition. If people want help or support, and I do think local authorities in certain parts of the country, not just necessarily London, might need some help, but it's about a willingness to want to work together, because I think centralised imposition is a disaster. And I've got to say, also having worked in new towns in part of my career, where unless you bring the local authority and give that local authority focus, what you end up with is you have a running organisation that can fund a lot of things, and as soon as they stop, it nosedives, and then there's a real struggle to get true, sensible governance in place. And I think the real mistake in new towns was never bringing local authority focus in quick enough. Great success from building roads, great success from doing things, but actually you didn't really have that long-term ownership. So I do think there's some need for help, but it has to sit under local authorities, not above them. I'm bringing it back to Thamesmead specifically. Yes, we have Bexley. Yes, we have Greenwich. They are very different local authorities, politically, aspirationally. But what has held that together is us as Peabody recognising as a large-scale landowner with ambition to address a lot of the issues over estate regeneration, etc. But it's done in response to what the councils want to see happen, and it's done sensitively, but ultimately it's done locally. And we are just one player, and we have no statutory authority whatsoever, and we absolutely respect that. And I think that's how you can garner partnerships. You've got to understand each role.
I know you want to go to Sakina, but I'm going to lose a body part. From
I haven't got a question.
Okay, I'm sorry. If Kate Willard will have a body part off me if I talk about the Thames Estuary Growth Commission in any Thames Growth Board in any other than a good way. And I think the reason that works well is because it's collaborative. It isn't directional. It doesn't impose. It's collaborative, and it gives us a chance to meet. And so I think that's what we need. We don't need imposition of any more visions. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, good. We're good. All right, I've been asked to go to Q&A.
Go for it.
Okay. Now, I'm going to ask another one because there's one that's come up a few times, and I'll throw this across the piece. This question of hybrid working being easier for people who are more affluent, who have the ability to stay home, who may have childcare near them. This applies to everywhere in terms of within London, in terms of anywhere across the UK, let alone the southeast. And I'm just going to throw this to Shona because I haven't asked you anything for a while, and it feels fair. In terms of this question about hybrid working and how does that work, what are you seeing in terms of the partnerships you work with?
I mean, thinking about it in the context of Thames Estuary Production Corridor, we are talking about a range of industries in which hybrid working will not be a possibility in some areas. I think it's also really important to recognise that 50% of the creative workforce is freelance. So, I mean, this is an enormous challenge for an underpaid, under-resourced industry. So yeah, there are issues around the kind of type of labour, issues around equality within that. It's a complicated picture.
Okay. Sakina.
Yeah, I mean, I won't add too much more than saying exactly as the question already sort of encompasses, which is working from home is an advantage that those who maybe have the space for study, the physical equipment, the money for energy bills, it leans towards people who fall into that category.
But what can we do?
What can we do? Yeah. Well, I think we need to ensure that employers know that there is an expectation for them to provide workplace, quite frankly. I don't think we should have a culture where there is an expectation for people to work from home. As Sean has already said, sometimes that's not possible at all, especially given the nature of work, whether you're freelance. But also, like we said, it comes down to money as well, in terms of if you're having to work for 8 hours in your bedroom, maybe even on your bed, what kind of quality of life are you going to have at the end of it? So I think we have to be really clear with employers that we expect them to provide workplace. And if that is not always possible, then like basic alternatives, like make sure your employees have equipment that you pay for, make sure that a health and safety assessment has been done so that people aren't developing like bodily difficulties because of the way that they're having to work, whether that's RSA or whatever. Or decentralize working areas so that people have a place where they can go. But I really want to emphasize that there is possibly a thin edge to a much bigger wedge of a culture change if we allow this sort of like very decentralized, individualized working from home culture. So we have to be really, really clear that people thrive when they're together. That's why we're here together in person rather than having this online. People synthesize really brilliant ideas. And if we are going back to the creative industries, that's absolutely the bloodline, that creativity, that spark you have with people. So I think, yeah, just being totally uncompromising and very clear with government, regional government and local government, that you need to put pressure on your employers to make sure that they supply appropriate workplace. Sorry, before you move on, in case we don't come back to this, I just want to give a big shout out to Unmish Desai in the audience, because we've talked about the long Good Friday film that I will go away and watch, and gangsters coming to East London. But London moving east is something that we've been talking about for a long time by someone led Unmish Desai. So I just wanted to make sure he got a proper shout out. He sat in the audience. And I definitely had a good read of this before coming on, so I recommend everyone do that afterwards. Sorry, Lisa.
I'm going to go to Shauna also. If anyone in the audience has a question, raise your hand. There's a mic around somewhere, and we'll keep an eye out for you. Shauna.
Thank you, Lisa. I just wanted to come back on 3 points. The first was that issue of childcare. Childcare is absolutely a productivity issue, and it's an equality issue as well. We have to answer this question because it is excluding talent from our workforce. And creating divides between employed and freelance populations as well. The second point was just around the opportunity of kind of resetting. You know, we've seen huge rise in demand in some industries and huge skill shortages. So if you take the film industry, for example, an enormous rise in demand. We've got like 580 TV shows shooting in the country this year alone. We've got something like upwards of 40,000 jobs that we need to fill over the next 5 years. Where is the opportunity to work with employers and work with industries to raise the quality of work, to raise the quality of pay through those opportunities? So where does all of this responsibility lie? And then the third point I wanted to make was around conditions for workers as well. So under the Mayor's leadership and with colleagues around the country through M10 and with Creative UK, we're working on how we could create a freelancers charter. So how can we work again with employers and more widely to look at the ways that people are treated within the jobs that they do too?
Thank you for that. I'm being flagged that the poll is back up. If you have responded, this is what you folks have said in terms of where do we most need collaboration between East London and the wider Southeast. Transport projects and commuter links is fairly obvious. I would say climate change is huge. I think ties directly to that because we sort of got into car culture, but not so much about congestion and air quality, housing and planning. I bet that would have been a lot higher a few years ago. Probably those of you in the room as well would have thought that, yeah, in terms of sending housing out towards the home counties would have been much bigger. And then joint calls for lobbying, increasing government recognition of leveling up needs. I think, Sakina, you've been eloquent on that today about what the government needs to do. Any final comment from you guys on working together? Jeremy, I'm going to come to you just because you are sort of at the crux of Kent, Essex, and London, but you're way out there for Kent, stuck close to us. Is it lonely?
I'll try not to be offended by that, yes. It is odd. I mean, the thing is, we don't want to be London. We want to have a really collaborative partnership with London. And I think the fear that we have is that some of the high density, and let's be honest, the urban errors that London have made will spread to us and the lesson won't be learned. And we don't want a purely development-driven growth. Dartford grows faster than almost any part of the country. And the reason is, of course, we're close to London. But we're not London. We're very clear, always make the point. We're in Kent. We're a separate borough. We are not the same as London. You know, London and Dartford are separate. One is a major international centre for the arts, culture, and business, and the other is London. We work really, really hard to make sure we've got this kind of sense of identity. And the worry we have is that what we see here works in brand new regeneration areas. In a place where you've got an existing community with existing aspirations, they don't want to see this. And they certainly don't want to see this morning, this is a great place. I'm sure this ticks all the boxes here. It's a great bit of regeneration. Anyone trying to find a coffee shop this morning or anyone trying to find life below floor 2 will find it very difficult. They seem to be shut off. It seems to be quite sterile. And I think we've got to remember that some communities in the country are not like that. We're a kind of old market town. So we want to work and be collaborative. We are taking our growth, we're taking our houses, but we just want to see the infrastructure come in to support us, really.
Can I make a plea, actually, at the end of this, too? For Future of London, I run Leaders Plus also in Greater Manchester. And I find myself, I was Chief Executive of Future of London for ages. I love it. I find myself having to say, can you say cities? Can you say people? And not say London, London, London all the time. This is Centre for London. We are in the home of the GLA. We're in City Hall. I feel like that's heresy, but it can't be, can it? Because if we want to have leveling up and get the funding that needs to come to us as well as everyone else, we need to have people on board. And I'm and I have to sort of ask my own colleagues to sort of say, remember it's everybody, remember it's everybody. That makes sense. So I appreciate that. Any final closing comments? comment?
I mean, I'd reiterate what you've just said, to be honest. I think London is here for collective levelling up. Like, we would love that. If you even just look at, the way that the funds are navigated by national government, money made in London goes elsewhere in the UK. We support that. We want to level up together. Trains that are used here by TfL in London are built in Yorkshire. Jobs here in London support jobs in Yorkshire. We are very much integrated, or kind of, how can I say this, committed to the integration of collective levelling up, but don't pit cities against each other. And that narrative and that rhetoric is coming from government, and that's dangerous and it's unhealthy, and it will hold back the whole of the UK. So absolutely, we should use every opportunity to say levelling up of all cities in the UK, all towns, all areas, because actually, like, when we work together, we all flourish. So just wanting to end on saying a big thank you to Centre for London for hosting a fantastic panel, but a fantastic day. It feels really good, especially on a bright Tuesday afternoon, to be beginning to, can't keep track of the days sometimes. Yeah, to beginning kind of what I hope are a lot more collective conversations about how we shape the future of our country and our world.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our panel. Thanks to all of you and to those of you at home. Good to see you. And I think I'm going to hand back over to Claire now and enjoy the rest of the day. There's lunch coming soon. Thanks, folks.
Hello again. I'm not going to tell you about the Slido number this time. We were due to be having the Minister for London, Paul Scully, join us for a live session today to tell us about his views on the topics we've been discussing. Unfortunately, parliamentary business has made that impossible, but I am reliably informed that very soon a video is going to come up of Minister Scully giving his remarks. So hopefully that's about to happen, and we will hear from Paul Scully, who has the most extraordinary job title. I think we've had some good ones today, but this one is very, very long indeed. He is the Minister for Small Business, Consumers and Labour Market, and the Minister for London at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So if government is a competition about how many words you can get in your job title, then he is winning. And I hope that we can move over to the video of Minister Scully now. Thank you for your patience. Oh, God.
Hi, I'd like to extend a warm thank you to the Centre for London for inviting me. I'm so sorry that I can't be there in person. It's currently 11 o'clock in the morning of the event, and I've been called to the Chamber for an urgent question on what I hope is a good news story for so many people that have been affected by the Horizon post office scandal over the last 20 years. But coming back to the job at hand as Minister for London, I'm committed to supporting the recovery and maximising growth across the capital. And I'm looking forward to hearing your discussion and catching up with it about how we can build on the strong recovery that we've seen so far to further level up and support the region. I'm sure that many of you would have reviewed the Levelling Up white paper following its publication last month. And I want to reassure you that levelling up doesn't mean dampening down the success of London. Instead, it's about improving living standards and unleashing enterprise and growth across all parts of the UK. Now, I'm under no illusion that there are concerns around the region that require my attention, and that London has its own unique set of challenges. The Levelling Up agenda can help address long-standing issues of economic inequality and deprivation in the region. So I was delighted to see that the first round of Levelling Up Fund delivered £65 million for 6 projects across London, with a particular focus on East London, as £49.1 million was awarded to community enhancing projects in Newham and Tower Hamlets. Now, I strongly encourage unsuccessful local authorities to bid through the second round of funding in spring 2022. And please do get your feedback as to how you can even strengthen your bid for that second tranche. But this is only one way that we are levelling up the region, with other funding commitments, including £8 million of getting building funding for 2 film studios in Newham and Barking and Dagenham, and £510,000 of community renewal funding to unlock green economy options in South Newham. Now, there will no doubt be many of you here today who have felt the negative impacts of COVID-19 and how that's been inflicted across the capital. But I'm really encouraged by the progress that the capital is making with its recovery following the onset of the Omicron variant. And it's heartening to see so many people returning to the office with the removal of the work from home guidance. Greater London has seen a 17.8% improvement in workforce mobility between January and February 2022. But it's important that we push for more people to return to their offices as we look to effectively live with COVID-19. Now, we know with the worst of the Omicron outbreak seemingly behind us, we're in a position to focus on those longer-term challenges surrounding London's recovery. And that includes the green economy and the levelling up agenda, both of which can be shaped by East and South East London. As we look to the future, there are really exciting opportunities and developments that will drive London's eastward growth. I'm incredibly proud to see how the East Bank development has progressed. £168 million being provided by government for the development of higher education and cultural centres, along with residential and commercial spaces. And it's estimated that the benefits of East Bank include an additional 1.5 million visitors to the Queen Elizabeth Park every year, the creation of more than 2,500 jobs, and the generation of £1.5 billion to the local economy. It was a real privilege to recently visit East London sites along the Thames estuary, including the Ford Dagenham plant, which is one of 4 key Thames Freeport partners. Initiatives like the Thames Estuary Production Corridor demonstrates how the Thames Estuary is a key facilitator of eastward economic growth. Now, a key mission of the Levelling Up agenda is for 200,000 more people to complete high-quality skills training annually until 2030. Barking and Dagenham has been chosen as one of only 3 employment and skills pathfinder areas in the country. That's going to bring employment and skills services together to support people into work. Now, in my role, I recognise the importance of a collaborative partnership between local government, central government, and the Greater London Authority. So in the light of this, I regularly meet with GLA and London Council senior leaders to identify and discuss policy areas critical to the capital's prosperity. I recently held a session on green jobs and skills opportunities, where we discussed the need for better working definition of green jobs and skills and more flexible funding to tackle the green skills gap. Additionally, I'm currently meeting with borough leaders from all 32 boroughs and the City of London to further understand local issues and opportunities. A recent conversation with Barking and Dagenham showed the borough has got real potential to grow into a highly productive industrial area by bringing new businesses to the region. It's been really enlightening and inspiring to hear directly from local government about the difference that they are making in their communities and how we can work together more effectively. I'm really looking forward to using my convening role within government to making progress on those local matters, though addressing concerns, but also making the most of opportunities. So just to finish, I'd like to reiterate that East and South East London have got a really pivotal role to play in aiding the UK's recovery, never mind London's, fulfilling our levelling up ambitions. And so I'd like to thank you all again for having me here today. Thank you.
Hard to know, isn't it, whether you applaud or not when somebody's not there. Well, thank you very much to the Minister and especially to the Minister's team at Bayes for putting that together for us so quickly. We would obviously very much like to welcome him here and hope he'll come to a future event, but I hope that gave you some flavour of what it would have been like to have a discussion with him here in person today. My last task before I release you all for lunch is to introduce Centre for London's Chief Executive, Dr. Nick Bowes, who's going to give our closing remarks for today. Nick, thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Just as Claire says, I'm Nick Bowes. I'm the Chief Exec of Centre for London. I've been Chief Exec for about 10 months now, which I still think I can claim that I'm new. And when I arrived this morning at the new City Hall, many of the security staff here thought that I still did my old job, where I worked at the old City Hall, and were asking me if I had a pass. So I'm glad to see that my absence has been noted this last 10 months. Can I make a very big thank you to Claire, who's been a fantastic MC today. It's not an easy job running hybrid events, certainly not when at the last minute some people are either remote or send clips. So thank you very much, Claire, for a fantastic job you've done today. And can I also thank all of the speakers and panelists today as well for the sessions and the really, really enlightening and thoughtful discussions that we've had. I'm going to mention A Long Good Friday as well. I'd already scribbled down to mention the film A Long Good Friday. The Docks Behind Us closed in 1980. That's 42 years ago. And as well as being very prescient in that film about the regeneration opportunities in the docks, Bob Hoskins' character also talked about bringing the 1988 Olympics to the east of the city. I mean, he was only out by 24 years, but actually it was fascinating if you've not watched that film to go back. And he has a huge model of the Isle of Dogs with the Olympic Stadium on it. And it's really fascinating timepiece, but it really also just shows the decay and the dereliction that there was east of Tower Bridge in 1980. And it feels like 40 years later, we're only really at half time in the regeneration of this part of London. Between Tower Bridge and Canary Wharf, an enormous amount of development has taken place. But beyond Canary Wharf to the city's boundary and beyond, there's still vast amounts to do, and there's enormous amounts going on now. And the Royal Docks behind you is the largest enclosed space of water in the world, I think is, I'm right. It's an enormous potential here for new homes, new workplaces, new businesses, new leisure facilities. And today we've heard a lot about what has worked well this last 42 years and what has worked less well. And we can use those discussions today to ensure that what happens next really does help to level up the rest of this part of East London, because it really does need it, and we need to make that work. So I don't want to delay people any longer from their lunch, but a couple of just final thank yous. Can I thank all of the sponsors without whose support today we would not have been able to run this event. And can I also thank the GLA for hosting us today at their new venue here. It's my first time in the new City Hall, and I'm guessing it's probably many of your first times here too. It's a fantastic space. And we're very grateful that they pulled the stops out to allow us to go ahead today, because I think the Mayor and the Assembly only moved in yesterday. So we really are the first big new event here. So, and thank you to everybody that's joined us here in person today and everybody that's tuned in at various points online. Please do stay for lunch, plenty more networking opportunities, and have a safe trip home. Thank you.